The divorce papers were still wet from the rain that had blown through the cracked kitchen window. Carter Hayes stood in the middle of the room, 32 years old, and felt something inside him go completely quiet. Not peaceful, just empty. The kind of empty that comes after you've already screamed everything out, and there's nothing left. His bank account had $412 in it. His wife's car was gone from the driveway. And in the back, behind the broken fence, sat a rotting garage that even the neighbors joked about tearing down. He had one reason to stay standing. His daughter was asleep upstairs. If this story finds you tonight, wherever you are, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this has traveled. Hit that like button and stay with me until the very end. Carter's story is just getting started. The rain had been falling since noon, not the dramatic cinematic kind of rain that arrives like a warning. This was the flat, gray, Midwestern kind that just settles, like it has nowhere else to be and doesn't particularly care what it ruins. It soaked the cardboard boxes stacked on the porch. It turned the backyard into a shallow pond. It drummed against the roof of the old garage in an uneven rhythm, finding every gap in the corrugated steel, dripping through in 4 separate places onto the oil-stained concrete below. Carter Hayes noticed the dripping because he was sitting on the floor of that garage, back against the workbench, knees pulled up, staring at nothing. He'd been sitting there for about 40 minutes. Inside the house, the divorce papers were on the kitchen table. He'd read them twice already, not because he didn't understand them the first time, but because some part of him kept expecting the words to rearrange themselves into something less final. They didn't. The language was precise and cold, the way legal documents always are, stripping 7 years of a marriage down to asset columns and custody schedules and a signature line at the bottom. Lisa had left the papers. She hadn't left a note. Her half of the closet was empty. The good coffee maker was gone. The photograph from their first anniversary, the one taken in front of that ugly fountain in Millport where they'd gotten caught in a different rain, laughing, soaking wet, that was gone too. She'd taken it off the wall and he hadn't even heard her do it. He thought he should feel more. He thought there should be rage or grief, or at least some loud, collapsing emotion that matched the scale of what had just happened to him. But sitting there on that cold concrete with rain tapping through the holes in the roof and the smell of motor oil and rust wrapping around him like something familiar, Carter Hayes mostly just felt tired. 32 years old. He did the math the way you do when you're sitting alone and the numbers are the only honest things left. The joint account, which Lisa had technically had equal access to, which he had not thought to question because he had trusted her, which he now understood was something she had quietly drained over the better part of 8 months, had $1,100 left in it. His personal checking had $412. The credit cards were maxed. There was a second mortgage on the house that he hadn't known she'd taken out until the bank letter arrived 6 weeks ago, which had been the beginning of the real unraveling, the moment the quiet arguments stopped being quiet. The garage wasn't worth anything. He knew that. The house itself, factoring the debt, was worth less than nothing in any practical sense. The truck ran but had 240,000 miles on it and a transmission that made a sound like a dying animal every time he hit 45 on the highway. What Carter had, at 32, after 7 years of working 60-hour weeks at Dunmore Manufacturing, after building what he'd believed was a life, was a garage. And a 5-year-old girl named Rosie who was, right now, asleep upstairs in a house that might belong to the bank within 6 months. He put his hand flat on the concrete floor. It was cold and gritty and real, and he pressed his palm against it hard, like he needed to feel the friction of something solid. The rain kept coming. One of the drips hit a rusted coffee can someone had left years ago, previous owners, probably, and it made a hollow tink, tink, tink that bounced around the empty space. Carter closed his eyes. He didn't pray. He didn't make any promises to the universe or himself. He just sat there and breathed slowly until the tightness in his chest loosened just enough to let him think. She's upstairs. That was the thought. Simple as that. Not inspiring, not a revelation, just a fact that organized itself in the front of his mind and refused to move. Rosie Mae Hayes, 5 years old, currently asleep with her stuffed rabbit named Captain and a nightlight shaped like a crescent moon, completely unaware that the floor of her life had just dropped out from under everything. She was going to wake up in the morning. She was going to come downstairs. She was going to want breakfast. Carter pressed his palm harder against the floor, felt the grit bite into his skin, and slowly got to his feet. Whoa. He'd grown up in Harlan County, in a house where the heat went out twice every winter and his father fixed it both times with parts he'd fabricated himself in the backyard shed. Earl Hayes wasn't a tender man. He was the kind of father who showed love through instruction, who communicated approval through the phrase, "not bad," and communicated disappointment through complete silence, which was somehow worse. But he'd taught Carter to use his hands. He'd put a socket wrench in Carter's grip when Carter was 7 and talked him through an oil change with the kind of patient precision most fathers reserve for catching baseballs. "You don't need to buy what you can build," Earl had said, probably 40 times, "and you don't need to beg for what you can fix." Carter hadn't thought about those words in years. He thought about them now. He stood in the doorway of the garage looking out at the rain and took inventory of what was around him, what was actually there, stripped of what it looked like on paper, stripped of its condition and its uselessness, and the way the neighbors had started calling it the eyesore at the block association meeting he'd only heard about secondhand. There was a workbench, scarred, warped at one corner, but solid. There were tools, his father's tools, the ones he'd kept after Earl died, the ones Lisa had lobbied to sell twice and he'd refused twice without entirely knowing why. A full socket set, 2 torque wrenches, a drill press that was older than Carter himself, heavy as a ship anchor, stubborn to start but precise as anything once it caught, a welder that he hadn't used in probably 3 years. There was space, dirty space, leaking space, but space. He stood there a long time, rain soaking the front of his boots. Then he went inside, heated up soup from a can because it was the fastest thing, ate it standing over the sink, went upstairs and sat on the edge of Rosie's bed in the dark and listened to her breathe for a while. That particular sound, slow and absolutely unconcerned with anything, which was the most grounding thing in his life right now. And then he went to the second bedroom, lay down on the bed that still smelled faintly like Lisa's shampoo, and stared at the ceiling until his body finally gave out. He slept 4 hours. When he woke at 5:15 in the morning, the rain had stopped. What? The first few weeks were, in practical terms, a disaster. Carter's position at Dunmore had been floor supervisor on the fabrication line. Decent salary, nothing remarkable, the kind of job that felt secure right up until the moment it wasn't. He'd taken a leave of absence 3 weeks before the divorce papers arrived, when everything at home had started coming apart, and he couldn't concentrate on shift rotations. Now, with the legal situation uncertain and his finances collapsing, going back to Dunmore meant dealing with HR and health insurance paperwork, and a supervisor named Dale Grimsby, who had never particularly liked Carter, and would now have the professionally appropriate pleasure of denying his return with a sympathetic expression. Carter called Dunmore on a Tuesday morning. He was on hold for 11 minutes. Rosie was eating cereal across the kitchen table, humming to herself, kicking her feet against the chair rungs. "Mr. Hayes?" Dale Grimsby's voice had the particular warmth of a man who is enjoying something he's pretending not to enjoy. "I did get your messages. I have to be honest with you, Carter. We've already filled the supervisor position. With everything that happened, I understand," Carter said. "We'd be happy to consider you for a line position, if that—" "I'll let you know," Carter said, and hung up. Rosie looked at him over her cereal bowl. She had her mother's eyes, dark brown, wide-set, and her father's jaw, which was strong enough that even at 5 years old she looked determined about things. She didn't ask who he'd been talking to. She just looked at him with that particular 5-year-old seriousness that meant she was paying attention to something she didn't yet have words for. "You want more milk?" Carter asked. "No," she said. "I'm good." He nodded. He poured himself coffee. He started with what he knew. The neighborhood had lawnmowers. Specifically, it had lawnmowers that the owners had either given up on or been quoted absurd prices to repair. Carter put a handwritten sign, actual cardboard, actual marker, at the end of his driveway. Small engine repair, reasonable rates, Carter Hayes. The first call came from a man 3 blocks over named Gerald Pitts, 68 years old, who had a riding mower that hadn't started since April, and whose son had told him it was cheaper to buy a new one. Gerald arrived on a Wednesday morning with the mower on a trailer. He was a big man, The kind of big that comes from decades of physical work rather than from intention, with hands like catcher's mitts and a voice that seemed to come from somewhere around his knees. "My son says I should just get a new one," Gerald announced, standing in the garage doorway while Carter crouched to look at the engine. "Says these old ones aren't worth fixing." "Maybe," Carter said. "That mean you agree?" "That means I haven't looked at it yet." Gerald made a sound in his chest that might have been a laugh. He leaned against the doorframe and watched Carter work with the particular attention of someone who knows machinery and is evaluating whether the person in front of him does too. The problem turned out to be a carburetor float that had corroded and was sticking, common issue in machines that sat through a wet winter. Carter had the parts, cleaned the carburetor, replaced the float with a component he machined himself on the drill press because the exact part wasn't in his stock, and had the mower running in 3 hours. Gerald stood there listening to the engine turn over with an expression that shifted slowly from skepticism to something else. "What do I owe you?" he said. $60. Gerald reached for his wallet, then stopped. "The shop downtown quoted me $400. "I know." Carter wiped his hands on a rag. "They were going to replace the whole carburetor assembly. You only needed the float." Gerald pulled out 320s and handed them over. Then he stood there a moment, not leaving. "You do other things?" he said. "Not just mowers?" "What do you have?" "Got a tiller that's been sitting for 2 years, and a friend of mine has a conveyor belt motor he's been trying to get someone to look at." "Bring them by," Carter said. Word moved the way it does in neighborhoods where people have time to talk. Slowly at first, then faster, person to person, over fences and at the gas station and in the parking lot of the Piggly Wiggly on Route 9. Carter fixed a bicycle with a bent derailleur for a teenager named Marcus, who lived on Elm Street, and Marcus's father came by 2 days later with a generator that had seized. Carter fixed the generator. The father told his brother-in-law, who managed a small landscaping company. The landscaping company had 6 pieces of equipment in various states of dysfunction. Carter worked 12-hour days. He got Rosie up at 6:30, made her breakfast, dropped her at kindergarten by 7:45, and was in the garage by 8. He picked her up at 3, made her a snack, and set her up at the kitchen table with coloring books or her tablet, while he went back to the garage and worked until 8 or 9. When Rosie went to bed, he stayed up later, researching parts, teaching himself from old repair manuals he found at the library and from the particular library of the internet that exists for people who fix things. YouTube channels run by men in their 60s who explain carburation with the exhausted patience of people who've answered the same question 10,000 times. He wasn't good at everything. There were jobs he had to turn away in those first weeks, things he genuinely didn't know how to do yet, and it cost him. There was a woman named Patrice who brought in a commercial-grade stand mixer that Carter spent 4 hours on before acknowledging he was making it worse, and had to refund her the deposit. That hurt. Not just the money, which was $40 he could not easily spare, but the admitting of it. Carter Hayes had been raised in the tradition where admitting you couldn't do something was done quietly, if at all, and felt roughly like taking a punch. But he learned from it. He learned to ask more questions before taking a job. He learned which things he was genuinely capable of and which things were outside his range and needed to be told so honestly, up front, without the ego of a man who'd rather damage someone's appliance than admit limitation. Rosie, for her part, adapted with the terrifying resilience of small children who have not yet been taught to understand how catastrophic things are, and so simply lived through them. She asked about her mother 4 times in the first 2 weeks, each time with a different angle. "Where is Mommy?" And "Is Mommy coming for dinner?" And "Did Mommy take Captain?" Captain was the rabbit. Captain was still there. And Carter answered each time as honestly as he could within the range of what a 5-year-old could actually absorb. "Mommy moved to a different house. When is she coming back?" Carter was quiet for a moment. He was washing dishes when she asked that one. He kept washing. "I don't know, Rosie." She absorbed this. She was quiet for a while, then, "Is she coming for my birthday?" "I'll find out, okay? I'll make sure she knows." Rosie nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to her drawings. Kids are like that. They ask the hard thing, hear the honest answer, file it, move on. Adults could learn a lot from it, and mostly don't. The moment that changed everything came on a Saturday morning in early October. about 6 weeks into Carter's garage operation. He got the call from a man named Frank Bauer. Frank Bauer farmed soybeans and corn on 400 acres about 12 miles outside of town, had been doing it for 30 years with his father before him, and currently had a combine harvester sitting in his field that had sheared a drive shaft fitting on a Tuesday and had been sitting dead ever since, during harvest season, which is approximately the worst possible time for a combine to stop working. Frank had called 3 repair operations. 2 of them had told him the part was back-ordered 4 to 6 weeks. The third had come out, looked at the machine, and told him the repair would cost more than the machine was worth, and recommended he look into leasing options. Frank had, by the time he called Carter, reached the specific stage of agricultural anger that sounds like perfect calm. "I got your number from Gerald Pitts," Frank said on the phone. His voice was flat, measured, the voice of a man who has decided to try one more thing before he loses his composure entirely. "He says you're good at fixing things other people won't touch." "I try to be," Carter said. "What have you got?" Frank described the machine. Carter listened carefully, asked 4 questions, paused. "Can I come look at it today?" "I was hoping you'd say that." Saw it. Carter loaded Rosie into the truck with a bag of snacks and her coloring books. He had no childcare on weekends yet, no system in place, no option that didn't cost money he didn't have, and drove out to the Bauer farm on a gray October morning with the fields brown and heavy and the smell of turned earth coming through the truck's window. Frank Bauer was waiting by the combine, arms crossed, jaw set. He was maybe 60, weathered in the way farmers get weathered, not dramatically, just worn down smooth in all the places where weather and work meet skin over decades. He looked at Carter's truck. He looked at Carter. His eyes moved briefly to Rosie, who was watching from the passenger window with frank curiosity. "That's your kid?" Frank said. "Yes, sir," Carter said. "She won't be any trouble. She's got books." Frank looked at him a beat longer, then looked at the combine. "It's the drive shaft fitting at the grain tank auger. The casting cracked. I've called everyone I can think of, and nobody has the part." Carter walked around the machine. It was an older model. Not vintage, but old enough that parts were genuinely harder to find. He crouched, examined the crack in the fitting, ran his fingers along the fracture. He stood up, walked back to his truck, got a notepad, wrote down dimensions. "I can make this part," he said. Frank looked at him with an expression that was carefully neutral. "You can make it. I have a drill press, a lathe I borrowed from my neighbor, and the right steel stock. The geometry isn't complicated. The tolerance on this fitting doesn't need to be fine. It just needs to be exact where it mates with the shaft. I can have something for you to try by Tuesday." The original casting was hardened steel. "I know what the original was." Carter met Frank's eyes. "I'm not going to insult it. I'll do what I can. If it doesn't work, you're no worse off than you are right now." Frank looked at him for another long moment. The wind moved through the dead corn rows, and somewhere in the distance a tractor engine turned over and caught. "Tuesday," Frank said. It wasn't a question. "Tuesday morning," Carter said. He worked through the weekend. Rosie fell asleep in the truck on the way home, and he carried her inside without waking her, laid her on the couch, covered her with the blanket from the back of the chair, and went straight to the garage. He worked until 2 in the morning on Saturday, referencing the dimensions he'd taken, working in the cast steel stock he had on hand, running the fitting through the drill press with the patience of a man who understands that rushing precision work is what makes it not work. He made 3 attempts. The first fitting was off by a margin that wouldn't matter in some contexts and would absolutely matter in this one. He set it aside, studied the measurements again, adjusted his approach. The second was better. Dimensionally correct within tolerances that Carter calculated by hand, twice, then a third time, because this was going into a man's combine during harvest, and he was not going to get it wrong. The third was right. He held it under the work light, turning it, checking every surface, checking the mating faces twice. It was not beautiful. It was a machined steel component, and its beauty was entirely functional, but it was correct. And Carter could feel the correctness of it the same way his father had once explained that you could feel a properly torqued bolt, not through the tool, but through the quality of the resistance. "You'll know when it's right," Earl had said, "not because it looks right, Because it stops arguing with you. Carter drove out to the Bauer farm Monday afternoon because he'd said Tuesday morning and wanted a margin for error. Frank came out of the machine shed when he heard the truck. He watched Carter come across the yard with the fitting in a cloth rag. "That's it?" Frank said. "That's it." They installed it together, Carter doing the primary work, Frank handing tools with the practiced efficiency of a man who has worked machinery his entire life. When it was in, Frank climbed into the combine cab, ran the grain tank auger, and they both stood listening to the machine run. It ran. Frank climbed down. He was quiet for a moment, his hand still on the ladder rail. "What do I owe you?" he said. Carter had thought about the number. He'd thought about what he needed versus what was fair versus what he was probably worth to this man right now, in this moment, with harvest running. $350, Carter said. Frank looked at him. "That's not enough." "It's what I'm charging." Frank reached into his jacket and came out with $500 in cash, actual cash, folded, the way older farmers sometimes carry money. He held it out. Carter looked at it, looked at Frank. "I'm not a charity case," Carter said. "No," Frank said. "You're a man who saved my harvest and charged me less than half what it was worth. Take the $500 and don't argue with me about it." Carter took the $500. On the drive home, Rosie, who had spent the repair session in the truck with her coloring books, periodically pressing her face against the window to watch, said from the passenger seat, "Did the big machine work?" "Yeah," Carter said. "It worked." "Because you fixed it?" "Yeah." Rosie considered this. "Daddy, do you fix everything?" Carter was quiet for a moment, watching the fields go by. "I'm working on it," he said. Frank Bauer called 4 other farmers, not because Carter asked him to. Carter had no marketing strategy, no business plan, no website, nothing resembling a professional operation beyond the cardboard sign at the end of his driveway. Frank called them because the combine was running during harvest, and that was the only advertisement that mattered in farming communities, where equipment failure is not an inconvenience but an existential event, and the person who solves it is remembered. By November, Carter had a waiting list. Not a large one. 6, 7 jobs at a time, mostly agricultural equipment, some industrial, some things he'd never looked at before that required him to spend 2 nights researching before he touched them. He made mistakes. He undercharged twice for jobs that took twice as long as he expected, which was a different kind of mistake, not technical, but financial. And he started writing estimates more carefully after that, building in contingency hours, learning the administrative discipline that doesn't come naturally to people whose instinct is to just start working. He hired a 16-year-old neighbor named Dion to watch Rosie on weekend mornings, which cost him $20 for 3 hours and was worth every cent. Dion was serious and responsible in the way of teenagers who have been trusted with things early, and Rosie immediately decided he was the most interesting person she'd ever met because he knew how to do card tricks. The garage leaked less. Carter patched the roof on a dry weekend in November, working from a ladder in the cold, resealing the corrugated panels with roofing compound, and replacing 2 sections that had gone thin with salvaged steel he'd found at a yard sale. It wasn't professional roofing work, and anyone who looked closely at it would know that, but it stopped the dripping. Some nights, after Rosie was asleep and the garage was quiet and Carter was cleaning the workbench before bed, he'd find himself standing in the doorway looking at the space around him, the tools on their hooks, the workbench with its burn marks and oil stains, the smell of metal and work that had become, in these months, more familiar than the smell of the house where he'd lived for 5 years. He didn't feel triumphant. He wasn't wired for triumphant. That was a different kind of man. What he felt on the better nights was something closer to a stubborn forward motion. The satisfaction of a man who has looked at the wreckage around him, picked out the pieces that still work, and decided to start building. Not from confidence, not from vision, from the only thing he had left. December came cold and clear. Rosie turned 6 on the 14th. Carter made a chocolate cake from a box, which was the only kind of cake he could make, and put 6 candles on it, and they ate it at the kitchen table, just the 2 of them, and Rosie sang happy birthday to herself partway through, because Carter had started laughing mid-song and couldn't finish it, and she decided she'd better take over. Lisa called that day. She called in the evening after Rosie was in bed. Her voice had the careful quality of someone who is trying to be kind without opening any doors. "How is she?" Lisa asked. "She's good," Carter said. "She had a birthday. She's good." A silence. "Carter." "She's good, Lisa," he said again. "Not unkind, just done with that particular conversation." "She's going to be okay. You can see her whenever you want. The offer's been there." Another silence. Then, I know it has." He didn't ask how she was. That was deliberate, not cruel, just self-protective, the way you make decisions when you know your limits. "I'll be in touch about the holidays," Lisa said. "Okay," Carter said. He hung up, sat at the kitchen table for a while in the dark, and then went out to the garage and organized his parts inventory until 11 o'clock, which was the kind of thing you do when you need to feel like something in the world is in order. On the workbench, next to the drill press his father had left him, was the failed first attempt at Frank Bauer's drive shaft fitting, the one that hadn't been right, that he'd set aside and never thrown away. He picked it up and turned it in his hands under the work light. He kept it on the workbench after that. Not for any particular reason, just to remember that the first attempt at something doesn't have to work. It just has to happen. By the end of winter, something had shifted in ways Carter hadn't anticipated. It wasn't that the business was thriving, it was surviving, which at this point was enough. But more importantly, surviving consistently, which was different. He had regulars. He had a rhythm. He had a reputation, which in a county where people talked to each other was its own kind of infrastructure. But the more significant shift was happening inside the garage itself, at the workbench, in the hours after the paying jobs were finished, when Carter would sometimes sit with a problem, not because a customer needed it, but because he'd started to notice something. The replacement parts he was making, components for older machines, substitutes for things that were back-ordered or discontinued or simply too expensive from the original manufacturer, were not just adequate. In several cases, they were better. Not because Carter was some kind of genius engineer, but because he was looking at the problems with fresh eyes, without the constraint of existing design templates, and because he had spent his entire working life on manufacturing floors watching where the standard parts failed. He started keeping a notebook. It was a plain spiral notebook, nothing special, the kind you buy in a 3-pack at the drugstore. He started writing things down in it, design ideas, observations about failure points, rough sketches of alternative component geometries. The handwriting was not elegant. Some of the sketches were embarrassingly crude, but the ideas were real, and once he started writing them down, he couldn't seem to stop. One night in late February, Rosie padded downstairs at 10 o'clock. She was a light sleeper, always had been, and found him at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of him, 3 pages of sketches spread around him, a mug of cold coffee he'd forgotten about at his elbow. "Daddy," she said, with the seriousness of a 6-year-old, "you were supposed to come say goodnight again." "I know," he said. "I forgot. I'm sorry, Rosie." She looked at the papers on the table. "What are you drawing?" "Parts for machines." She came around the table and looked at the sketches, studying them with her arms folded across her chest, the way she folded her arms when she was thinking hard. "That one looks like a snail," she said, pointing. Carter looked at the sketch. "It kind of does," he admitted. "Is it a good snail?" He thought about it. "I think so. I think it might be a pretty good snail." Rosie nodded, apparently satisfied. "Okay," she said. "Come say goodnight." He put a paperweight on the notebook, an old cracked socket he kept on the table for exactly this purpose, the way other people keep paperweights, and followed her upstairs. He lay on the edge of her bed until she was asleep, which took about 3 minutes because she dropped off the way kids do when they feel safe, immediately, completely, without any of the adult architecture of anxiety that keeps grown people awake. He lay there in the dark, listening to her breathe, looking at the moon-shaped nightlight. The notebook was downstairs on the kitchen table. The garage was behind the house, cold and quiet, with its patched roof and its scarred workbench and its tools hanging on their hooks. And something, not confidence, not yet, but the thing that comes before confidence, the stubborn conviction that the direction is right even when the destination isn't visible. Something had taken root in Carter Hayes. in that place where a man goes when he has nothing left but the work in front of him and the breathing of the person he loves most in the world. He didn't know, on that February night, where any of this was going. He just knew he was going to keep going. That, for now, was enough. The spiral notebook filled up in 6 weeks. Carter didn't plan it that way. He wasn't the type to set goals around things like filling notebooks. That felt too much like the kind of self-improvement language you found in magazines and waiting rooms, next to headlines about decluttering your life and waking up at 5 a.m. But the ideas kept coming, usually at inconvenient times, usually when his hands were already dirty and he had to wipe them on his jeans before he could write anything down. He started keeping the notebook on the workbench instead of in the house, which meant it acquired oil stains and the occasional grease thumbprint along the margins, which bothered him briefly and then stopped bothering him completely. March arrived with the kind of weather that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Cold one day, almost warm the next, the sky cycling through gray and clear and gray again with no apparent pattern. The calls kept coming. Frank Bauer had sent him 3 new farm customers over the winter, and one of those farmers had a cousin who ran a small machine shop in Calverton, the next county over, who had started sending Carter overflow work. Not much, a component here, a repair job there, but it was something new. It was work that came from reputation rather than necessity, which felt different in a way Carter couldn't quite articulate but could feel. He hired Dion 3 mornings a week now, instead of just weekends, which Dion seemed to regard as a promotion even though his rate was still $20 for 3 hours, and which Rosie regarded as a purely positive development because Dion had taught her 4 more card tricks and was currently attempting to teach her to whistle, with limited success. The money was not comfortable. Carter did not make the mistake of confusing, not drowning with swimming. He was keeping the house, barely, the second mortgage payments grinding through his checking account each month, like something he'd accepted as a permanent physical ache. He was feeding Rosie. He was keeping the lights on. He'd paid down one of the 3 credit cards by $70, which felt like bailing out a flooding boat with a teacup, but was still better than not bailing. He kept a handwritten ledger on the corner of the workbench. Income, expenses, parts costs, what he was owed, what he owed. And he looked at it every morning the way doctors look at charts. Honestly, without flinching, even when what it showed him was difficult. Some mornings it was very difficult, but the notebook kept filling. And the thing about filling a notebook with ideas is that eventually you have to decide what the ideas are worth, which is a different kind of reckoning entirely. It was Gerald Pitts who pushed him into it, which was fitting, since Gerald had been his first real customer and had developed the proprietary habit of dropping by the garage on Tuesday mornings under the premise of checking in, though Carter suspected Gerald's real motive was that he lived alone and liked having somewhere to be. "Show me what you've been drawing," Gerald said one Tuesday, nodding at the notebook. He'd seen Carter reference it a dozen times without ever asking directly, which for Gerald counted as remarkable restraint. Carter hesitated. The notebook felt private in a way the repair work didn't. The repairs were just labor, but the notebook was something else, something that could be wrong in a more exposed way. And Carter Hayes did not especially enjoy being exposed. Gerald waited with the patience of a 68-year-old man who had nowhere else to be. Carter pushed the notebook across the workbench. Gerald picked it up and went through it slowly, turning pages with those catcher's mitt hands, studying the sketches with the unhurried attention of a man who understood machinery. He didn't say anything for several minutes. Outside, a truck went by on the road. Somewhere in the house, Rosie was talking to herself in the particular running monologue she kept up when she was playing with her toys, her voice carrying faintly through the wall. "This one," Gerald said, pointing to a sketch on page 14. It was a redesigned auger fitting, similar to the one Carter had made for Frank Bauer, but modified based on what he'd learned about why the original design failed. "You put the reinforcement here instead of here. The original design concentrates stress at the junction," Carter said. "Move it 8 millimeters and you spread the load. It's not complicated, it's just nobody redesigned it because the original worked well enough, and well enough is good enough if you're running a manufacturing line. But it's not good enough if it breaks every 4 years during harvest," Gerald said. "Exactly." Gerald looked at him over the notebook. "Have you priced what it would cost to make these in quantity?" Carter was quiet for a moment. I've thought about it. Thinking isn't pricing. No, Carter said. It isn't. Gerald set the notebook down on the workbench. He picked up the original failed fitting, Carter's first attempt at the Bauer component, which was still sitting there, and turned it in his hand. My son-in-law runs a machine shop in Elmore. Bigger operation than this. He's been looking for subcontract work. Gerald, I'm not offering you money, Gerald said with mild offense. I'm telling you a fact about my son-in-law's business situation. What you do with that fact is your business. Carter looked at the notebook. He looked at the fitting in Gerald's hand. His name is Terry, Gerald said, setting the fitting down. He'll answer the phone if I call first. He paused. I'll call first. Carter didn't say thank you, which Gerald seemed to understand was not rudeness, but the particular stubbornness of a man who needed to believe he was doing things on his own terms. Gerald nodded, picked up his coffee mug. He'd taken to bringing his own mug, which Carter had stopped remarking on, and looked at the workbench with an expression of general approval. Your roof patches are holding, Gerald said. Yeah. You did that yourself? Yes. Not bad, Gerald said, which from Gerald Pitts was a significant endorsement. He called Terry Marsh the following Thursday. The conversation was brief and uncomfortable in the way of conversations where both parties are trying to determine something without asking directly. Terry was polite, professional, and transparently skeptical, which Carter preferred to dishonest enthusiasm. They agreed to meet the following Tuesday at Terry's shop in Elmore, which was 40 minutes away, which meant Carter had to arrange for Dion to watch Rosie for 4 hours on a weekday, which Rosie was going to be fine about, and Dion was going to charge extra for, which was entirely fair. Carter spent the intervening days preparing. He took 3 of the designs from the notebook, the ones he was most confident in, the ones he'd worked through most thoroughly, and made proper technical drawings of them, dimensioned and annotated, the way he'd learned at Dunmore, where engineering drawings had been the daily language of the floor. His handwriting wasn't good, and his drafting was imperfect, but the designs themselves were sound, and he knew they were sound, and that knowledge sat in him like ballast. The night before the Elmore meeting, he was at the kitchen table late, going over the drawings for the 4th time, when Rosie appeared on the stairs in her pajamas. You're not sleeping, she said. It was not an accusation, just an observation. She made a lot of observations. I have a meeting tomorrow, Carter said. She came down the stairs and stood on the bottom step, which put her at approximately table height. What kind of meeting? Business meeting. She thought about this. Are you nervous? Carter looked at his daughter. 6 years old, hair still in the messy remnants of the braid he'd attempted that morning. He was getting marginally better at braids, looking at him with those wide, dark eyes that didn't miss much. Yeah, he said. A little. She nodded, as though this confirmed something. Dion gets nervous about tests, she said. He says he draws on his hand, little pictures. Then he's not nervous. Dion draws on his hand. Little pictures, she confirmed. Not big ones. Carter looked at his drawings on the table, then back at his daughter. Okay, he said. I'll try that. She appeared satisfied. Come say good night. Go up. I'll be there in 2 minutes. She went back upstairs. Carter sat at the table for a moment, then, feeling slightly ridiculous, picked up a pen and drew a very small, very bad snail on the back of his left hand. He went upstairs and said good night. The next morning, driving to Elmore with the drawings in a folder on the passenger seat, he glanced at the back of his hand on the steering wheel. The snail was still there, slightly smudged, absolutely absurd. He was still nervous, but it was a manageable kind of nervous. Terry Marsh's shop was larger than Carter expected. A proper facility, not a garage operation, with 3 CNC machines and a full welding bay, and 5 employees who moved around the floor with the efficient rhythm of people who were busy. Terry himself was about 45, lean and precise in his movements, the kind of machinist who kept his personal workspace immaculate as a matter of professional principle. He shook Carter's hand and looked at him with the frank, evaluative attention of someone who has been called by his father-in-law and is trying to determine whether this was a favor call or a legitimate referral. Carter spread the drawings on Terry's workbench. Terry looked at them. He didn't say anything for a while. The Auger fitting, he said finally. I've seen this design. Everyone uses this design. Everyone uses it, and it fails at the same place every 3 to 5 years, Carter said. Move the reinforcement ring here, he pointed, and you add maybe $4 to the manufacturing cost, and you double the service life. Maybe more. Terry studied the drawing. Where'd you learn to draft? Dunmore Manufacturing. I ran a fabrication floor for 6 years. You're not at Dunmore now. No, Carter said. Terry let that sit without pushing on it, which Carter appreciated. He went through the other 2 drawings with the same deliberate attention, asking specific technical questions, some of which Carter answered confidently, and at least 2 of which he answered with, "I'd have to work that out properly," because giving an overconfident answer to a machinist was the wrong kind of wrong to be. At the end, Terry straightened up and looked at Carter. "I'm not going to tell you these are revolutionary," Terry said. "I didn't say they were. But the fitting design is genuinely better. I've replaced that fitting in my own equipment twice. If you can spec this out properly, and we can get the manufacturing cost under $12 a unit, there's a market." Carter nodded. He'd run the numbers. $12 was achievable. "I can't be your production facility," Terry said. "I don't have the capacity, and that's not the direction I want to go. But I can help you find someone who is, and if you're going to take this to market, you're going to need more than 3 drawings in a folder." "I know that." "You'll need a proper product spec, possibly a provisional patent on the design if it's sufficiently differentiated. You'll need to talk to someone who knows the agricultural supply market." Terry paused. "Do you know anyone in that space?" "Not yet," Carter said. Terry studied him another moment. "Gerald says you're good. Gerald is generous." "Gerald is not generous," Terry said flatly. "Gerald is the least generous person I know with a compliment. When Gerald says someone is good, they're good." He picked up Carter's folder and handed it back. "Get me a proper spec on the fitting. If the numbers work, I'll introduce you to some people." Carter drove home with the windows down even though it was cold, because he needed air, because something that had been very tight in his chest for several months had just loosened a fraction, and he needed to not let that run away from him into something like hope before he'd done the work to justify it. He picked up Rosie from school, took her for ice cream because it was a Tuesday, and there was no particular reason, and sometimes you just needed a Tuesday to have something in it, and sat across from her at the ice cream parlor while she worked through a bowl of strawberry with the focused commitment of a child who takes dessert seriously. "How was school?" he asked. "We learned about seeds," she said. "If you put a seed in dirt and water it, it grows." "That's right. But it takes a long time," she said. "The teacher said some seeds take a really long time before anything happens, even if you're doing everything right." Carter looked at his daughter. "Yeah," he said, "that's true." Rosie considered her ice cream. "That seems hard," she said. "Waiting when you don't know." "It is," Carter said. "You just have to keep watering." She seemed to accept this as a reasonable policy. She went back to her strawberry. Carter drank his coffee, which was bad diner coffee and was therefore perfect, and watched his daughter eat and thought about seeds. The proper spec for the auger fitting took him 3 weeks to produce. He worked on it in the evenings after Rosie was asleep, learning as he went, technical specification formats, tolerance standards, material specifications. He made mistakes and corrected them. He sent 2 drafts to Terry by email, which felt strange because he'd been operating entirely on handshakes and cardboard signs for months, and Terry sent back comments that were blunt and useful. On a Wednesday evening in late April, Terry sent a single-line email. "Spec looks good. I'm going to make some calls." Carter read it at the workbench, under the work light, with the smell of metal and oil around him. He read it twice, then set the phone down and kept working on the brake component he'd been rebuilding for a customer's tractor, because that was the actual paying job, and the actual paying job came first. But something had shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way that felt like a movie moment. There was no swelling realization, no meaningful pause in which he understood that the tide had turned. It was more like the specific feeling of having walked uphill for a very long time and suddenly noticing, without ceremony, that the ground has leveled out. You're still walking, your legs still hurt, but the incline is gone. Spring proper arrived, and with it, more work than Carter could comfortably manage alone. The agricultural community had its own telegraph, Word traveled at the speed of one farmer talking to another across a fence line, or at the co-op, or at Margie's Diner in Kinsley, where half the county seemed to eat breakfast on Friday mornings. Carter's name had been moving along that telegraph since the Bauer harvest, accumulating the specific credibility that comes from actually solving actual problems. By May, he had 17 active jobs, which was too many for one man in a leaking garage, except the garage had stopped leaking and the man had started keeping better hours. He hired his first real employee on the 3rd of May. His name was Bobby Tran, 24 years old, trained as a machinist who had been doing intermittent work at a shop in Dunmore that had cut his hours and who'd heard about Carter through a mutual acquaintance in the kind of roundabout 6 degrees way that small county employment often works. Bobby came by the garage on a Saturday afternoon and stood in the doorway looking at the setup with an expression that was either skeptical or calculating. It was hard to tell the difference with Bobby, as Carter would learn. "This is the whole operation?" Bobby said. "Currently," Carter said. Bobby looked around slowly. His eyes stopped on the drill press, the welder, the lathe Carter had formerly purchased from his neighbor 6 weeks ago when the neighbor needed cash. "What are you turning out?" "Repair work, mostly, but I've got a new product moving into spec, agricultural components." "What kind of volume?" "Early stages, but growing." Bobby turned and looked at him directly. He was a compact man, not tall, with the kind of economy of movement that good machinists develop. Nothing wasted, everything deliberate. "What are you paying?" Carter told him. Bobby was quiet a moment. "That's not great." "I know. I can do better in 3 months if things move the way I think they're going to move." "Why would I believe that?" Carter met his eyes. "You probably shouldn't entirely, but you're here on a Saturday afternoon instead of somewhere with better guaranteed pay, so something about the situation interests you." Bobby almost smiled. "Gerald Pitts talks about you at Margie's." "Gerald talks too much," Carter said, without heat. "He says you're building something real." "I'm trying." "Trying isn't building," Bobby said. "No," Carter said, "it isn't. Give me 6 months and see what it is." Bobby looked around the garage one more time. At the workbench. At the notebook, which was the 3rd notebook now, the first 2 having filled and been shelved above the workbench where Carter could reference them. At the tools on their hooks, which were more numerous and better organized than they'd been in the fall, because Carter had reinvested almost everything back into the operation. "Monday?" Bobby said. "Monday," Carter said. Bobby nodded and left. Carter watched him go, then went back to the brake component, which was not going to finish itself. Having Bobby in the shop changed things in ways Carter hadn't entirely anticipated. The practical benefits were obvious: doubled capacity, a second set of skilled hands, someone to handle jobs while Carter worked on the design side. But there was also the less obvious shift that comes from having another person in a space that has been, for months, entirely yours. The dynamic of solitude changes. You become aware of yourself differently. You make different decisions, some better and some just different, because you're operating in front of someone who is evaluating your competence as an ongoing condition of his employment. Bobby was good. More than good, actually. He was precise and fast and had an instinct for problem solving that Carter recognized as the kind of thing you either have or you don't, that you can refine but not teach from scratch. He was also blunt in a way that Carter found useful after an initial period of adjustment. "You're undercharging the Callaway job by 30%, Bobby said, 2 weeks in, looking at the estimate Carter had written on a yellow legal pad. Carter looked at the estimate. "Their equipment is older. They don't have the margins." "Their margins aren't your problem. Your margins are your problem. If I charge them what the job is actually worth, they go somewhere else or they don't fix the equipment." Bobby set the legal pad down. "Then you need to build a payment option, or you need to accept that not every customer is your customer, but you can't keep eating the difference." Carter knew he was right. He'd known it before Bobby said it. Sometimes you need someone to say the thing you already know before it becomes actionable, which is an irritating quality of the truth. He raised the Callaway estimate. The Callaways paid without negotiation, which was also irritating, in a different way. May moved into June. Terry Marsh made his calls, and the calls led to a meeting, and the meeting led to a conversation with a regional agricultural parts distributor named Hendricks Supply, based in Caldwell, who had 3 people look at Carter's auger fitting spec and came back with a purchase inquiry for 500 units as a trial order. 500 units. Carter sat on the workbench and read the email twice, and then a third time to make sure he understood what it said. 500 units at a per-unit price that, after manufacturing costs, would represent more revenue than he'd generated in the entire first 4 months of his operation. Bobby came in from the yard where he'd been doing a rust assessment on a conveyor belt housing and found Carter sitting on the workbench staring at his phone. "You okay?" Bobby said. Carter held out the phone. Bobby read the email. His expression didn't change dramatically. Bobby's expressions rarely did. But something shifted in his eyes. He handed the phone back. "You got a manufacturer lined up?" Bobby said. "Not yet." "You need to move fast. Trial orders go away if you take too long." "I know. So what are you going to do?" Carter put the phone in his pocket. He looked around the garage. At the workbench, the tools, the notebooks, the patched roof, the whole improbable accumulation of 8 months of grinding stubbornness, and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not relief. Not even satisfaction. Something closer to the feeling of a man who has been running on one engine for a very long distance and just heard the second one catch. "I'm going to make some calls," he said. Bobby nodded. He went back to the conveyor housing. Carter called Terry Marsh. Terry's network opened doors that Carter hadn't known existed. A precision manufacturer in Harwick who did contract runs and had availability in his schedule. A materials supplier who offered net 30 terms that Carter had never been in a position to qualify for before and barely qualified for now. The logistics of getting 500 units manufactured, quality checked, packaged, and shipped to Hendricks Supply required Carter to operate in a mode he had never operated in before. Not as a repairman, not as a machinist, but as someone who had to coordinate moving pieces he didn't personally control. He made mistakes. He underspecified a material detail on the initial production order, which the manufacturer caught before it cost him anything more than an embarrassed phone call and a corrected specification. He misjudged the shipping timeline and had to have a direct conversation with his contact at Hendricks Supply, a woman named Paula Hendricks, daughter of the founder, who ran the business with the pragmatic directness of someone who had grown up around it, explaining the delay. 2 weeks, Carter said on the phone. "I should have built in more buffer. That's on me." Paula was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate you telling me directly instead of letting me hear it at the last minute. It's your order. You deserve to know." "It is," she said. "Can you guarantee the quality?" "Yes," Carter said. He said it without hesitation because he had checked the specs himself, had been to Harwick twice during the run to observe the process, had pulled sample units and tested them himself in the garage until he was certain. "All right," Paula said. 2 weeks. Keep me updated." The unit shipped on a Thursday morning. Carter was at Harwick when the truck loaded, standing in the facility loading bay watching pallets of components, his components, designed in a spiral notebook on a workbench in a leaking garage, disappear into the truck one by one, and feeling something he couldn't quite name and didn't try to. He drove home with the windows down again. Rosie was doing homework at the kitchen table when he got in. Real homework now, first-grade homework, reading exercises that she treated with the seriousness she brought to most things. She looked up when he came in. "You went to the factory again," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd gotten good at reading his face. "Yeah." "Did it go okay?" Carter sat down across from her. He looked at his daughter, 6 years old, doing her reading homework at the kitchen table in the house he'd almost lost, in the town where he'd started over from the ground, in the life he was building one stubborn day at a time. "Yeah," he said. "It went okay." Rosie studied his face the way she did, carefully, the way she'd learned to read him over these months. Then she seemed to decide he was telling the truth and went back to her homework. "There's leftover pasta," she said. "I put it in the fridge." "You put it in the fridge?" "Dion showed me how to use the wrap." Carter stood at the kitchen door for a moment, just looking at his daughter covering her homework sheet with her 6-year-old handwriting, absolutely focused, completely unaware of how much of his world she anchored. "Rosie," he said. "Hmm?" "Good job with the pasta." She didn't look up, but she smiled, just slightly, at her paper. 3 weeks after the shipment landed at Hendricks Supply, Paula Hendricks called. "We've had good feedback on the fitting," she said. "Some of our customers have already come back saying the installation went clean." "Good," Carter said. "We'd like to talk about a larger order and about some of your other designs." A pause. "Do you have other designs?" Carter looked at the notebooks on the shelf above the workbench. 3 full notebooks. The fourth about a third of the way done. Hundreds of pages of sketches and annotations and problem analysis and redesigned components accumulated over 8 months of working after midnight while a 6-year-old slept upstairs. "Yeah," he said, "I have other designs." "Then I'd like to come see your operation," Paula said. "Next week, if that works." Carter looked around the garage. At Bobby, who had overheard and was now looking at him with his characteristic unreadable expression. At the workbench, which was better equipped than it had been 6 months ago, but was still, unmistakably, a garage. At the notebooks, at the patched roof, at the whole honest reality of what the operation was. "Next week works," he said. He hung up. Bobby was still looking at him. "She's coming here," Bobby said. It was not entirely a question. "Yeah." "To this garage." "Yeah." Bobby looked around the space with the evaluative eye of a man mentally cataloging everything that needed to be cleaned, organized, or hidden. "Okay," he said. "We've got a week." "We're not hiding anything," Carter said. "She sees what it is." Bobby looked at him. "I wasn't going to hide anything. I was going to clean things. There's a difference." Carter looked at the floor, which admittedly had not been swept in some time. "Fair," he said. They cleaned, they organized, they did not hide anything. The garage was still a garage, still bore the marks of everything it had been and everything that had happened there. The oil stains that were never coming fully out of the concrete, the notch in the workbench from a slipped bit 2 months ago, the patched roof that anyone who looked up would recognize as exactly what it was. Carter decided, consciously, not to apologize for any of it. Paula Hendricks arrived on a Tuesday morning in a practical sedan, wearing practical clothes, which Carter took as a good sign. She was about 50, gray-haired, and moved through spaces the way people move when they've spent their careers actually working rather than managing from a distance, looking at things closely, touching things, picking up the sample fittings on the workbench and feeling the machine surfaces with her fingertips. She went through 2 of the notebooks while Carter talked her through the designs. She asked specific questions, good questions, the kind that revealed actual knowledge of the agricultural supply market, of what farmers needed versus what they were currently being sold. Bobby stayed in the background and kept working, which Carter hadn't asked him to do, but which was exactly right. At the end, Paula set the notebook down and looked at Carter steadily. "You're operating on thin capital," she said. "Yes?" "This is still a very small operation." "Yes." "And you've been doing this for less than a year." 8 months, Carter said. Paula looked around the garage one more time. At everything it was. At the notebooks. At Bobby, precision working at the lathe. At the patched roof, which she had absolutely noticed. "My father started Hendricks Supply in a converted barn with 2 employees and a beat-up forklift," she said. "So, I don't make assumptions about square footage." She looked back at Carter. "I'm going to propose a supply agreement. Multiple product lines to start, volume pricing that scales as your output scales." She paused. "You'll need to expand. This space won't hold what I'm thinking." The garage was quiet except for the lathe turning steadily. Carter met Paula Hendricks' eyes, and what he felt was not triumph, not elation, not the uncomplicated joy of a man whose gamble has paid off. What he felt was more specific than that. It was the feeling of a thing that was real, that had weight, that had been built from actual work and actual failure and actual stubbornness, and was now, unmistakably, becoming something he hadn't dared to fully imagine. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. Paula Hendricks sat down on the stool Carter kept by the workbench, pulled a yellow legal pad from her bag, and started talking. The notebook was on the shelf above them. The patched roof held. Outside, it was a clear June morning, and the light was coming through the garage door in the long flat way that summer light does when the day is still early and there is still everything ahead of it. Paula Hendricks's yellow legal pad had 6 pages of notes on it by the time she left the garage that Tuesday morning, and Carter stood in the doorway watching her sedan pull out of the driveway with the particular feeling of a man who has just agreed to something large enough that his body hasn't yet processed the full weight of it. Bobby came to stand beside him. "Well?" Bobby said. "Supply agreement," Carter said. "Multiple product lines. She wants the auger fitting, the drive coupling redesign, and 2 others from the notebooks. Volume commitment through the end of next year." Bobby was quiet for a moment. "That's real." "Yeah." "You need more space." "I know." "You need more equipment." "I know, Bobby." "And you need at least 2 more people." "I know all of this," Carter said, not unkindly, because Bobby was right about everything, and Carter had already been running the numbers in his head during the last 20 minutes of Paula's visit, sitting on the workbench with his arms crossed while she talked, watching the figures arrange and rearrange themselves with the automatic focus of a man who'd been keeping a manual ledger for 8 months and had developed, out of necessity, a very clear relationship with math. The problem was not the opportunity. The problem was what the opportunity required before it could become revenue. Equipment purchases, facility expansion or relocation, additional payroll. All of it needed capital that Carter did not currently have, that the business was not yet generating at sufficient scale, and that a bank would view with the polite but firm skepticism reserved for one-man garage operations with 8 months of history and no formal business structure. He went inside, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with his ledger and his calculator and a legal pad of his own, and worked for 3 hours. Rosie was at school. Bobby had locked up the garage and gone home. The house was quiet in the particular afternoon way that houses get quiet when there's a lot of weight in them. The numbers were not impossible. They were not good, but they were not impossible, which was the most Carter could say about most things in his life right now. He could self-finance a portion of the needed equipment by liquidating what was left of the small personal investment account he'd managed to keep Lisa from touching during the divorce proceedings, something that had required an argument he didn't like to think about, conducted through lawyers in language that cost him $400 an hour. That account had just over $19,000 in it. A down payment on a proper CNC mill would eat most of that. The rest would have to come from somewhere else. He called his bank on Wednesday morning. The loan officer he spoke to was a woman named Sandra Pratt, who was professionally kind in the way of people who are about to tell you something you don't want to hear. "Your revenue history is strong for an operation of your size and age," Sandra said, "but the underwriting requirements for a business loan at this level are going to require collateral," Carter said. "Among other things, yes. Do you own the property?" "The house is mortgaged, heavily." "Business assets?" Carter thought about the drill press his father had left him, the lathe, the welder, the torque wrenches. "I have equipment, and I have a signed letter of intent from Hendrick's Supply." Paula had given him that before she left, a formal letter on Hendrick's letterhead, which Carter had read 3 times in the truck before he drove back into the garage, running his thumb over the Hendrick's Supply logo. Sandra was quiet for a moment. "Bring that letter in," she said. "It doesn't solve all of the underwriting questions, but it's meaningful. Come in Friday and we'll go through it properly." Carter went in Friday. He wore the button-down shirt he'd bought for Rosie's school conference in February, which was the most professional garment he currently owned. He brought the letter, his ledger, the actual handwritten ledger, which he'd been warned might not be what they needed, but which represented the most honest accounting of his business that existed, because he had been the one keeping it every morning for 8 months. And the 3 notebooks, because he wanted them to understand that the letter of intent was not a lucky accident, but the output of a documented, ongoing design process. Sandra went through the ledger with visible surprise at its comprehensiveness, which Carter chose not to take personally. She went through the letter. She looked briefly at the notebooks with the expression of someone who had not expected to encounter spiral-bound design notebooks in a bank meeting, but was adjusting. In the end, she offered him a loan at terms that were not what he'd asked for, but were not nothing. Enough, combined with the investment account, to purchase a refurbished CNC mill, lease a larger space in the Dunmore Industrial Park 7 miles away, and hire 2 additional machinists for a trial period of 90 days. "It's less than you asked for," Sandra said. "It's enough to start with," Carter said. He signed the paperwork on a Thursday afternoon and drove to pick up Rosie from school, feeling the particular combination of terrified and committed that is the specific emotional signature of having just made an irreversible decision. There was no taking it back now. The money was moving. The lease was being drawn. The CNC mill, located at a shop closure in Brentwood, examined by Carter and Bobby on a Tuesday, approved, negotiated down from the asking price by $800 through a conversation that had made the seller visibly uncomfortable but ultimately relent, was being transported. Rosie got into the truck with her backpack and immediately knew something was different. "What happened?" she said. "Good things," Carter said. "Complicated good things." She looked at him sideways for a moment, the way she'd started looking at him when she suspected he was managing his answer. Like what? "We're moving the business to a bigger place." Her eyes went wide. "Bigger than the garage?" "Yeah." "How much bigger?" "A lot bigger." She processed this. "Is the garage going away?" Carter thought about that. He thought about the oil stains on the concrete that were never coming out, the patched roof, the workbench with its burn marks, and the socket wrench that had been his father's, the notebooks on the shelf, the failed auger fitting on the corner of the bench that he'd kept for no practical reason, that had simply stayed there through everything, the first ugly proof that the first attempt doesn't have to work. "No," he said, "the garage isn't going away." Rosie seemed relieved by this in a way that was hard to articulate but real. She settled back in the passenger seat. "Okay," she said. "Good." The industrial park space in Dunmore was not glamorous, which was fine because Carter was not in the glamour business. It was a concrete floor unit, 4 times the size of the garage, with proper 3-phase electrical and loading dock access, and a heating system that actually worked, which Carter recognized as a luxury only because he'd spent a winter working in a garage where the space heater had been a negotiation with cold rather than a solution to it. The lease was a commitment that made his stomach tighten every time he thought about the monthly number, which was why he tried not to think about the monthly number in isolation and instead thought about it in the context of the Hendricks supply agreement and what that represented in revenue. Bobby walked the space on the first day and said, "It's clean," which was the highest praise Bobby typically offered for anything. The 2 new machinists were a woman named Carla Odom, 38, who had 17 years of precision machining experience and had been laid off from a manufacturing plant in Harwick when they relocated operations out of state, and a young man named Jesse Pruitt, 26, who was still learning but had what Bobby described, after working alongside Jesse for 2 days, as good hands and better instincts, which from Bobby was extravagant. The first month in the new space was the hardest, not because the work was wrong, but because scaling is its own discipline, separate from the discipline of doing the work itself, and Carter had not fully reckoned with that distinction. Managing 4 people, Bobby, Carla, Jesse, and himself, required a different mode of operation than the 2-person rhythm he and Bobby had developed. Communication broke down twice in the first 2 weeks on production specs, costing time on jobs that the schedule couldn't absorb. Carla and Jesse had different working styles that needed to find equilibrium. The CNC mill, despite being certified functional before purchase, needed a calibration adjustment in its 3rd week that Bobby caught before it affected product quality, but that cost a full day to address. Carter handled some of this well and some of it badly. The spec miscommunication he handled badly because his first instinct was to solve it himself rather than establishing a system. He rewrote 2 specs himself at midnight rather than sitting down with Bobby and building a proper review process. And Bobby told him, the next morning, with the bluntness that Carter had come to depend on, that this was the wrong approach. "You can't be the only check on everything," Bobby said. "You're already in 3 roles. Don't add a 4th. I know what the specs should look like." "So do I," Bobby said. "And so does Carla. Let me and Carla sign off on specs before they go to production. You review our review. That's 3 sets of eyes, and it costs you 20 minutes instead of a midnight rewrite." Carter didn't like it, which Bobby could see clearly. Carter had been doing everything himself for long enough that delegation felt, at a cellular level, like relinquishing something important. But he recognized the resistance as his own limitation rather than as a reasonable position, which was the most you could ask of yourself in moments like that. Okay, Carter said. Okay, Bobby said, and went back to the mill. The calibration issue with the CNC, on the other hand, Carter handled better than he expected, because when Jesse caught the drift and came to him with it, Carter's first response was to listen completely before he said anything else, which had not been his natural instinct a year ago, but was becoming one. He asked Jesse questions, looked at the numbers, went to the machine himself and ran the diagnostics. And when Bobby came to look, Carter was already on the phone with the repair service with the problem correctly diagnosed and the solution underway. Jesse watched all of this. Later that afternoon, when they were both running a production batch, Jesse said, without looking up from the machine, "You didn't make me feel dumb for bringing it up." Carter looked at him. "Why would I?" Jesse shrugged. "Some places, you find a problem, the boss acts like you caused it." Carter thought about Dale Grimsby at Dunmore, who had operated on exactly that principle. "That's a waste of information," Carter said. "You found a problem before it became product. That's what I need you to do." Jesse nodded, still not looking up, but something settled in his shoulders. September came, and with it, the first full production run under the Hendricks supply agreement. 400 units of the auger fitting, which Carter and his team produced over 3 weeks, with a defect rate of less than 1% on final inspection, which Carter calculated and recalculated because he didn't trust the number the first time, and then the second time, and finally accepted on the third time because the inspection log was what it was. Paula Hendricks called when the shipment arrived at her distribution center. "Quality is good," she said. "Better than good. 3 of our customers have already asked specifically for your fitting over the standard catalog part." "That's what it's designed to do," Carter said. "I know it is." A brief pause. "I'm going to be straight with you, Carter. I have competitors who are going to notice this product when it starts gaining market share. They're going to try to find out who makes it." "They'll find out," Carter said. "That's fine. Some of them are going to come at you with underpricing, or they're going to try to copy the design." "The design is provisionally patented," Carter said. Terry Marsh had helped him navigate that process 4 months ago, a filing that had cost him $800 he hadn't had comfortably, but had spent anyway because some investments are not optional. "Good," Paula said. "But I want to expand the agreement. I want 3 more product lines in the next 6 months. And I want to write a first refusal on any new designs you bring to market in the agricultural sector." Carter stood at his desk in the corner of the Dunmore facility. His actual desk, not a workbench, an actual desk, which felt strange every time he sat at it, like wearing someone else's clothes, and thought about what she was saying. "Write a first refusal means I can still go elsewhere if you don't match the offer," he said. "Yes." "Then I'll consider it." "Carter, I'll consider it, Paula. I'm not saying no. I'm saying I want to look at the language before I agree to anything." Another pause, and then something that might have been Paula Hendricks almost smiling, or the closest thing to it that came through a phone. "Fair enough," she said. "I'll have legal send something over." He read the agreement twice himself and then paid a lawyer $250 for an hour of her time to read it with him, because the days of trusting his own reading of legal language on important documents had ended with the divorce papers on the kitchen table in the rain, and he was not going back to that particular lesson. The lawyer, a woman named Rita Espinoza, who ran a small practice in Dunmore and had the efficient manner of someone who respects your time because she charges for it by the minute, sat across from him and went through the agreement with a red pen, which she used twice to mark language she suggested modifying. "The exclusivity window on new designs is 60 days, Rita said. "That's too long for your negotiating position. Get it to 30. They'll push back. Then 35, but not 60. 60 is long enough that it constrains your growth options if another buyer comes in with timing." Carter got it to 32 days in the negotiation, which Paula's legal team accepted without significant resistance, which told Carter that 30 was probably achievable and he'd left 2 days on the table. He filed that away for the next negotiation. The agreement was signed on a Friday afternoon in October, exactly 12 months and 1 week after the Saturday morning when Frank Bauer had arrived at his driveway with a broken combine and a farmer's particular brand of controlled desperation. Carter thought about that sometimes. The specific geometry of how things connect, how the right problem at the right moment for the right person can be the hinge that everything else swings on. He drove home that evening, stopped at the house, picked up Rosie from Dion's care, and then, without planning it, drove past the industrial park and up his old street and parked in front of his house. Not to go in, they still lived there, had never left, but just to sit for a moment, to look at the driveway where the cardboard sign had been, where Gerald had backed his trailer in, where Bobby had first stood and said, "This is the whole operation?" Rosie looked out the window at their own house, then at her father. "Why are we sitting here?" she said. "Just looking," Carter said. She looked at the house, then at him, in that way she had. At what? He wasn't sure how to answer that in a way a 6-year-old could absorb. He was looking at the distance, maybe, at how far from this driveway to the Dunmore facility and what had happened in the space between. At the garage behind the house, which he could see from here, the roof he'd patched in the cold, the door he'd left unlocked more nights than he could count because he'd been in and out so many times he'd stopped bothering. "At where we started," he said. Rosie looked at the house again. "We started here?" "Yeah." She appeared to consider this seriously. "It looks the same," she said. "That's kind of the point," Carter said. She accepted this with the pragmatic readiness she brought to things that were too adult to fully parse, and went back to looking out the window. Carter sat for another moment and then put the truck in drive. October moved into November. Hayes Industrial Technologies. He'd registered the business formally in September, having been operating under a DBA that was increasingly insufficient, was generating revenue on a trajectory that Carter tracked in the ledger with the same morning discipline he'd kept since the beginning. And the numbers were no longer the source of the particular low-grade dread they'd been for the better part of a year. They were not comfortable. Carter suspected he would not feel comfortable with the numbers until the second mortgage was gone and the business loan was substantially reduced, and there was a cushion he could look at without calculating how many months of payroll it represented. That was some time away. But the direction was right, and Carter had learned to trust direction over position. He hired 2 more people in November. A production coordinator named May Lin, 42, who came from a medical device manufacturer and was dramatically overqualified for the role as it currently existed, which Carter acknowledged directly in the interview. "This is a smaller operation than you've been running," he told her. "I know," May said. "I've done my research." "Why do you want it?" She looked at him steadily. "Because in 12 months you've built something that should have taken 3 years, and I'd rather be somewhere with momentum than somewhere with inertia." She paused. "And your quality numbers are better than companies twice your size. That tells me about the culture." Carter hired her. She was, within 60 days, indispensable in the way that certain people become indispensable, not through drama or demonstration, but through the quiet accumulation of problems solved before they reached him, systems built that he hadn't had time to build himself, communication with the Hendricks account that was more organized and responsive than what he'd been managing alone. Bobby watched May's first 2 weeks with the careful attention he gave all new things, and then said to Carter with characteristic economy, "She's good." "Yeah," Carter said. "You should pay her more." "I'm going to," Carter said, "as soon as I can." Bobby nodded. "Sooner than you think you can," he said, which was the closest Bobby Tran ever came to saying something like, "The money is coming, trust it," and which landed on Carter with more weight than a more effusive encouragement would have. December arrived cold and demanding. The Hendricks account grew. Orders came from Hendricks customers directly, farms, equipment dealers, small manufacturers, some of whom had heard about Hayes Industrial through the fitting and were inquiring about other products. 3 of Carter's notebook designs were now in production. A 4th was in spec development, a redesigned bearing housing for a line of commercial tillers that addressed a vibration failure point Carter had identified during a repair job 18 months ago, which felt like a lifetime from now. He started getting calls from people he didn't know. Some of them were customers. Some of them were potential suppliers who'd heard his name through the agricultural supply network. Some of them were competitors, identifiable by the particular way they asked questions, professional and indirect, trying to determine production capacity and pricing structure without revealing the purpose of the inquiry, which Carter recognized because it was the kind of question he himself asked when he needed to understand a market. And some of the calls were from investors. The first serious one came on a Tuesday afternoon in early December, a man named Douglas Park, who represented a regional private equity group called Mast Capital. He introduced himself cleanly and explained his interest without preamble, which Carter appreciated. "We've been watching Hayes Industrial for about 3 months," Douglas said. "The Hendricks relationship, the design pipeline, the revenue growth. We think there's a significant growth opportunity here with the right capital injection." Carter sat at his actual desk in the Dunmore facility and looked at the production floor through the glass partition. Bobby at the CNC mill, Jesse running a quality check, Carla working through a batch of drive couplings, May on the phone with Hendricks. 5 people counting himself. A year ago it had been a cardboard sign on a driveway and a drill press that was older than he was. "What kind of capital injection?" Carter said. Douglas named a number. Carter kept his face neutral, which was easier on the phone. It was a significant number. A number that would eliminate debt, fund the equipment needed for the next 2 product lines, add 4 or 5 people, and push the company into a competitive position that would take 3 years to reach organically. It was also a number that came with terms. "What percentage of the business?" Carter said. Douglas told him. Carter wrote the number down on his legal pad. He looked at it. "And the governance structure?" "Board seats commensurate with the stake. Operational involvement would be, how many board seats?" A slight pause. 3 of 5. Carter put his pen down. "That's majority control." "It's standard for an investment at this level," Douglas said smoothly, "the way people say things that are true but are also designed to make you feel that questioning them is unsophisticated. We're long-term partners, not day-to-day operators. Our interest is in growth, not in a company you have majority board control of," Carter said. Not combatively, just clearly. Douglas moved his approach. "Carter, the opportunity window here is real, but it's also time-limited. The agricultural components market is moving. If you're not capitalized to scale in the next 12 to 18 months, larger players will take the position you're building toward." "Maybe," Carter said. "Your competitors are not standing still." "I know that." "Then you understand why this timeline matters." Carter looked through the glass at his production floor, at the 5 people working, at the CNC mill his father's tools had helped him buy the first down payment on, at the ledger on the corner of his desk, which he still kept by hand even now that May had set up a proper accounting system, because some habits were not about efficiency. He thought about what this company had cost him to build. Not the money. The money was calculable. The other costs. The weight of the first winter. The mornings he'd gotten Rosie up and made her breakfast and gotten her to school and come back and stood in the garage in the quiet and chosen to keep going. The specific quality of that choice, which had not been made once but hundreds of times, daily, in small moments that didn't feel like decisions at the time but were. "I appreciate the interest," Carter said, "and I don't disagree about the market timeline, but I'm not in a position to give majority governance in what I've built. If Mass Capital wants to have a different conversation about a different structure, I'm willing to have that conversation." Silence on the line. Douglas Park had clearly expected a different response. "What structure would you consider?" "Minority stake, 1 board seat, full operational autonomy. Those are my starting positions." Another pause. "That's a significant departure from our standard—" "I understand that," Carter said. "I'm not asking you to do something that doesn't work for your model. If it doesn't work, I understand and there's no hard feeling, but that's what I'm willing to discuss." Douglas Park said he would take it back to his partners. His tone had gone from polished to professionally cool, which Carter recognized as the transition from salesmanship to evaluation. He hung up and sat at his desk and felt the weight of what he'd just said no to, or possibly no to, because the call was still open. He sat with that for a while. Bobby came in at the end of the shift with a production report. He set it on Carter's desk and noticed Carter's expression. "What?" Bobby said. "Got a call from an investor. Significant offer." Bobby looked at him. "And?" "I told them I'd want different terms." "Meaning you said no?" "Meaning I said not like that." Bobby studied him for a moment. "Is that smart?" "I don't know," Carter said honestly, "but it's what I can live with." Bobby picked up the production report, looked at it briefly, set it back down. "The numbers this month are the best we've had," he said. "I saw." "Whatever you decide about the investor," Bobby said, The foundation is solid. That's not nothing to negotiate from. He left. Carter sat at the desk as the production floor quieted and his people filed out at the end of shift. Bobby's particular efficient departure, Jesse's louder leaving-taking that usually involved a comment to Carla, May's last-to-leave routine of checking her desk twice before she went. Carter stayed after everyone else, the way he often did, the building settling around him into its end-of-day sounds. He called Mass Capital back 3 days later, not because they'd come back to him, but because he decided what he actually wanted. Douglas Park answered and went through the standard professional reopening pleasantries, and Carter let him do it, and then said, "I've thought about the structure. 30% stake, 1 board seat, operational control stays with me, and a design licensing arrangement that generates returns for Mast without requiring the equity play if that's a cleaner structure." Douglas was quiet. "The licensing arrangement is interesting? I thought it might be. What are you thinking on the licensing terms?" "I'm thinking that's the conversation we should be having in person," Carter said. "My facility. This week, if that works." There was a pause. And then Douglas Park said, "Thursday?" "Thursday," Carter said. He hung up and looked at the production floor through the glass. Quiet now, the machines still, the overhead lights on their evening setting. 14 months ago, he'd been sitting on the concrete floor of a leaking garage with $412 in his checking account and divorce papers on the kitchen table. He thought about Rosie's homework that night. She was in first grade now, working on something about plants and what they need to grow, which she took home and worked on with the same focused seriousness she brought to everything. She'd asked him at dinner, "Daddy, what's the most important thing a plant needs?" He'd said water. She'd said the book said light. They'd agreed that probably it needed both, and other things besides, and that the book was simplifying. He'd thought about that conversation more than once in the days since, in the particular way you think about things that arrive as one thing and mean another. He opened his desk drawer and took out the 4th notebook, the one that was 2/3 full, the one with the bearing housing sketches, and the new coupling design, and 14 other ideas in various stages of development, ideas that represented the next chapter of what Hayes Industrial could become. He set it on the desk in front of him. Thursday was 3 days away. The company was real. The foundation, as Bobby had said, was solid. And Carter Hayes, 33 years old now, the man who had sat on a cold concrete floor and looked at a rusting workbench and decided that it was enough to start with, Carter Hayes was not done building. He opened the notebook to the next blank page. He picked up his pen. He started to write. Douglas Park arrived on Thursday with 2 other people from Mass Capital, a financial analyst who said almost nothing, and a legal associate who said slightly more than nothing. And Carter met them in the Dunmore facility with Bobby present because Carter had learned in the 14 months since his world had come apart that having someone in the room who would tell him the truth afterward was worth more than the appearance of going it alone. The meeting lasted 2.5 hours. Carter walked them through the production floor first, which he did deliberately, not to impress them with scale, because the scale was modest and they all knew it, but because he wanted the negotiation to happen in the context of what was actually real. The machines, the people, the products sitting in quality inspection, the tangible substance of what had been built. Douglas Park watched the floor with the attentive eyes of a man who had learned to read operations, and Carter could see him making adjustments in real time, recalculating something against whatever model Mass Capital had built around Hayes Industrial from the outside. They sat down at the work table Carter used for production reviews. Not a boardroom, just a table with good light and chairs that didn't match. And Douglas opened with a counter to Carter's proposed structure that was better than Carter expected and worse than he wanted, which meant it was approximately where a real negotiation begins. They went back and forth for 90 minutes. Carter held the operational autonomy position without moving, because that one was not a negotiating chip, it was a condition, and he'd decided that before Douglas arrived. On the equity percentage and the licensing structure, he moved because those were legitimate negotiations, and holding firm on everything was the posture of a man who needed the other person to lose, not of a man who needed a deal that actually worked. They landed at 34% equity, 1 board seat, a design licensing arrangement on new products that gave Mass Capital a return path that didn't require board control to execute, and a capital infusion that was 80% of what Douglas had originally offered. When Douglas extended his hand across the table, Carter shook it. "You're a careful negotiator," Douglas said. "I've been paying attention," Carter said. Bobby said nothing during the drive back from seeing the mass capital team to their cars, which meant he was thinking. Carter waited. "The licensing structure is good," Bobby said finally. "That was smart." "Rita suggested it." "You should send Rita something." "I'm going to," Carter said. Bobby looked at the production floor. "What happens now?" "Now we move fast," Carter said. "Equipment first. Then people. May has the hiring specs ready. I asked her to prepare them 2 weeks ago." Bobby turned to look at him. "You were that sure you'd close it?" Carter thought about that. "I was sure that if I didn't close this one, there would be another one. But yes, I thought we'd get there." Bobby absorbed this with a small nod that might have contained somewhere inside it something like respect. The capital moved within 3 weeks. Carter had the equipment ordered before the wire cleared, which his bank flagged as slightly aggressive and which Carter explained was time-sensitive, which it was. 2 new CNC machines. An expanded quality inspection setup that May had spec'd out with the particular precision of someone who understood that quality control was not a cost, but an insurance policy. Build-out of an additional 600 square feet in the Dunmore facility, taking the adjacent unit that had been sitting empty for 4 months while Carter watched it and waited. He hired 3 more people in January. A second production coordinator, a quality technician, and an engineer named Priya Nair, 29, who had a mechanical engineering degree from State and 18 months of industry experience, and who walked through the facility on her interview day with the quietly hungry attention of someone who recognized an interesting problem when she was standing inside one. "Your design process," Priya said during the interview. "How formalized is it?" "It's not," Carter said honestly. "It's mostly notebooks." She looked at him. "Show me." He showed her the notebooks. She went through them with a speed that suggested she was not reading sequentially, but pattern matching, finding the through lines, understanding the design logic beneath the individual sketches. She asked 3 questions while she read, all of them specific and structurally useful. "You need a proper design workflow," she said when she finished. "Not to replace this. The instinct in here is good, but you're going to lose design continuity as you scale if the whole system lives in spiral notebooks." "I know that," Carter said. "Can I build it?" Carter looked at her. "That's part of what I'm hiring for," he said. Priya joined on a Monday and had a preliminary design documentation system drafted by the following Thursday, which she presented to Carter and May with the no-ceremony directness of someone who had done her thinking before the meeting and considered the meeting itself to be for decisions, not discovery. Carter hired her at the salary she'd asked for, which was more than he was comfortable with and less than she was worth, which Priya appeared to understand was the honest state of a company at this stage and accepted without drama. February. The production floor was now running 2 shifts, well, not full second shift, not yet, but 4 hours of second shift capacity that Bobby supervised, which had required a conversation about Bobby's compensation that Carter had been preparing for and which went better than expected because Carter had prepared honestly. "You've been doing supervisor-level work for 6 months, Carter said. "Your pay hasn't caught up. It's going to catch up now." Bobby looked at the number Carter wrote on the paper. "That's closer," Bobby said. "It'll go further in 6 more months, Carter said. Bobby folded the paper. "I know," he said. "You've always done what you said." That was the thing about trust. It was not built in moments of generosity, but in the accumulation of small kept promises, the alignment of what you said with what you did, repeated often enough that it became the operating assumption. Carter had learned that too, in the garage, in the months when keeping promises was the only currency he had. It was in the 3rd week of February that the article ran. He hadn't known about it in advance. May brought it to him on a Tuesday morning, a piece in Midwest Manufacturing Quarterly, a trade publication Carter had been aware of but had never been mentioned in, with a headline about emerging agricultural component suppliers disrupting the traditional supply chain. Hayes Industrial was the 3rd company discussed, which was a paragraph and a half, which quoted the Hendricks supply relationship and the revenue growth figure that Douglas Park had apparently shared with the reporter, which Carter had not authorized and would have a brief pointed conversation with Douglas about. But the article was real, His company's name was in a trade publication. People he'd never met had read a paragraph and a half about what he was building, and some of them were going to call. They called. Some were the expected inquiries, suppliers introducing themselves, a distributor in the Southwest who wanted to talk about carrying the Hendrix product line in their region, two equipment dealers who had seen the fitting in their customers' machines and wanted to understand the sourcing. These were good calls. Carter handled them or routed them to May with notes on context. Some were the less expected calls. A journalist from a regional business publication who wanted to do a longer profile, which Carter declined because he didn't feel the company was far enough along for that kind of visibility to be useful rather than premature. A former Dunmore manufacturing colleague who'd seen the article and called to congratulate him with the particular warmth of someone who is also taking stock of their own trajectory. And on a Thursday afternoon in late February, a call from a number he didn't recognize with a New York area code, which he almost didn't answer and then did. "Carter Hayes?" The voice was a woman's, direct without being abrupt, the kind of voice that was accustomed to being taken seriously. "My name is Vivian Sterling. I'm the managing partner at Sterling Meridian Capital. I think you've built something worth talking about." Carter had heard of Sterling Meridian Capital, the way anyone who read business news casually had heard of it. A firm known for early-stage investments in industrial technology and infrastructure companies, run by its founder, who had made a significant number of very correct calls on companies before they were obvious and had, by most accounts, done so through a combination of research depth and a particular instinct for identifying the difference between a good product and a real business. He'd never expected to be on the receiving end of that particular instinct. "Ms. Sterling," he said, "what did you want to talk about?" "Your design philosophy," she said. "Not your financials. I've seen the relevant numbers. What I'm interested in is how you think about the problem you're solving." It was not the question he'd expected, which was probably the point. "Can you be more specific?" he said. "The agricultural components market has been dominated by the same manufacturers for 40 years, she said. They optimize for production efficiency and margin, not for the actual failure points their customers experience. You've been solving for the failure points. That's a different business logic. I want to understand how deliberate that is." Carter leaned back in his chair. Through the glass partition, the production floor moved in its rhythm. Machines running, people moving with the practiced efficiency of a team that had found its stride. "It started as a repair business," Carter said. "When you're fixing things that other people built, you spend a lot of time looking at where they failed. You can't help noticing the pattern. And the pattern became your product line." "The pattern became my notebooks," Carter said. "The product line came later." A brief pause. "I'd like to come see your operation," she said. "Not as a formality. I've been watching Hayes Industrial for 4 months, and I have a specific perspective on where it could go that I'd like to discuss in person." 4 months. The article had only run 2 weeks ago, which meant she'd been watching before that, through whatever channels a firm like Sterling Meridian used to identify companies before they were visible. Carter noted this and did not mention it. "When?" he said. "2 weeks. I'll come to you." He told her 2 weeks worked, confirmed the location, and ended the call. Then he sat for a moment with his hands flat on the desk, the way he'd once pressed his palm flat against the cold garage floor, needing friction, needing something real beneath him. He called Rita Espinoza. "I need an hour," he said. "I have a meeting in 2 weeks I want to think through." "Who's coming?" Rita said. "Vivian Sterling." A pause that was just slightly longer than Rita's pauses usually were. "Of Sterling Meridian." "Yes?" Another pause. "I'll clear my Thursday," Rita said. He told Bobby that evening, after the shift, walking the production floor the way Carter did most evenings. Not inspecting, just moving through the space, which he'd come to understand was not a management technique but a need, a way of staying connected to the physical reality of what they were building. "Sterling Meridian," Bobby said. "You know them?" "I know what they are," Bobby said. "What do you think she wants?" "I think she wants to invest," Carter said. But the way she asked the first question suggests she's trying to determine something first, whether the business logic is real or whether we've been lucky. Bobby considered this. Have we been lucky? Carter thought about the Bauer call at 6 weeks in, about Gerald Pitts at the Tuesday morning diner run, about Terry Marsh's son-in-law and Paula Hendricks's yellow legal pad, about the 17 things that had needed to go right, and had. Some, he said. But the product is real. The design is real. You can have good timing and still have nothing underneath it. Bobby nodded slowly. So you're not worried about the meeting? I didn't say that. Are you worried? Carter looked at the production floor, at the machines that hadn't been there 18 months ago, at the team, Bobby, May, Priya, Carla, Jesse, the others, doing work that was creating something that had not existed when Carter had been sitting on cold concrete with nothing left but a drill press and his father's tools. I'm going to be ready, Carter said. That's what I can control. The 2 weeks before Vivian Sterling's visit were among the most focused Carter had operated in since the early garage days, and in a different way. Not the desperation focus of a man with nothing but the single-minded clarity of a man who understands that the meeting he is preparing for could change the trajectory of everything he's spent 2 years building, and who has enough respect for that possibility to take it seriously. Priya built a proper design portfolio, organized, documented, the notebook's ideas translated into professional format without losing the thinking underneath them. May prepared a clean financial presentation, the kind that showed not just where they were, but how they'd gotten there, month by month, which Carter had insisted on because he didn't want to show Vivian Sterling a polished snapshot. He wanted to show her the actual shape of the thing, including the months that had been hard. Bobby said, when Carter told him this approach, most people would try to hide the hard months. Most people would, Carter agreed. Why aren't you? Because if she's as good as her reputation, she already knows they happened, Carter said. And if I present like they didn't, she knows she's talking to someone who manages optics instead of reality. I'd rather she see the reality and make her decision about that. Bobby thought about this. That's either very smart or very exposed. Yeah, Carter said. It's both. Vivian Sterling arrived on a Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock, which was exactly when she'd said she would arrive. Carter noticed the punctuality and noted what it said about how she operated. She came with one person, an associate, young, who stayed in the background with a laptop, and the focused quiet of someone who had learned which meetings required presence and which required invisibility. Vivian Sterling was 30 years old, which Carter had known from the research he'd done but which still registered in person, because 30 was not what you expected when you encountered someone with her reputation. She was not particularly imposing physically, medium height, sharp-dressed without being studied, the kind of put-together that came from habit rather than effort. What was imposing was the quality of her attention, which Carter recognized immediately as the same quality he'd noticed in Paula Hendricks, and in Frank Bauer, and in Bobby himself on his first day. The attention of people who are actually looking at things rather than looking at what they expect to see. She shook Carter's hand, looked him directly in the eyes for about 1 second longer than was casual, and said, "Walk me through the facility first." He did. He showed her everything he'd shown Douglas Park, but differently, because Douglas had been evaluating an investment, and Vivian seemed to be evaluating something harder to define. She stopped at the quality inspection station and asked Priya 3 specific technical questions about tolerance standards, which Priya answered correctly and in detail, and Vivian listened with the full attention of someone who was actually assessing the answer rather than waiting for it to finish. She stopped at Carter's desk and looked at the notebooks on the shelf. "Those are the originals?" she said. "Yes." She picked up the first one, the oil-stained one, the one with Rosie's comment about the snail in the margin, the one that had been sitting on a workbench in a leaking garage when nobody knew Hayes Industrial Technologies was going to exist. She went through it slowly, the way Gerald had gone through it 2 years ago, with the real attention of someone who understood what they were looking at. She set it down without comment, and they sat at the work table. Carter had May's financial presentation ready. He started with it, walking Vivian through the month-by-month progression that he'd insisted on showing. The thin months, the turn, the growth curve, the current position. Vivian watched it with her hands folded on the table, asking nothing. When he finished, she said, "The Mass Capital deal." 34%, 1 board seat, Carter said. "Operational control stays with me." "That was your condition from the start?" "Yes." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because I know what I'm building," Carter said. I don't need someone else to decide what it is. That's not always true of founders, she said. Sometimes it's ego talking instead of clarity. Sometimes it is, Carter agreed. I can't prove to you which one this is. You have to make that call. Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not a smile exactly, but a recalibration. She picked up one of the technical spec sheets Priya had prepared and looked at it. The bearing housing redesign, she said. You identified the vibration failure point during a repair job. About 18 months ago, before the company existed in any formal sense. How long before you put it into a spec? About 8 months. Why the gap? Survival, Carter said simply. I was keeping the lights on. The design work happened in the margins of that. Vivian looked at the spec sheet. Most investors would see that gap as a liability, slow development timeline. And how do you see it? She set the sheet down and looked at him with the full weight of that particular attention. I see a founder who didn't let a good idea get ahead of the business's ability to support it. That's rarer than you'd think. Carter said nothing. He let her continue. Here's what I think, Vivian said. Hayes Industrial has a genuine design advantage that is currently being monetized through one primary distribution relationship and one minority investor who got in at a price that was fair for the risk but will look very cheap in 18 months. You have a design pipeline that is not fully capitalized, and you are personally managing at least 3 roles that need to be separate functions within 2 years. Carter looked at her. Those are accurate observations. I know they are, she said without arrogance, just as a statement of fact from someone who had done her work. So here's what I'm proposing, not what I'm willing to do. What I'm proposing, because the terms need to be yours as much as mine for this to work the way I think it can. She laid out the structure. It was different from anything Douglas Park had brought, not larger, necessarily. The capital number was comparable, but the architecture was different. Sterling Meridian would take a minority position, smaller than Mass Capital's stake, with no board seat. Instead, the arrangement included a strategic advisory relationship, Vivian personally, not a junior associate, 2 days a month minimum, access to Sterling Meridian's industrial network, which was deep in the sectors Hayes Industrial was moving toward, and a design licensing structure that created a revenue share rather than an equity dependence. Why minority with no board seat, Carter said. You're giving up governance. I'm not interested in governing your company, Vivian said. I'm interested in it succeeding on your terms so that my investment reflects what you actually build rather than what a board decides to optimize for. Carter was quiet for a moment. That's an unusual position for a firm at your level. I have an unusual view of what makes industrial companies succeed, she said. Board control usually degrades the thing that made the investment interesting in the first place. She paused. I don't want to degrade what you've built. Carter looked at the table for a moment. He thought about the Mass Capital negotiation, about the line he'd drawn on governance, about Douglas Park's professional cool when Carter hadn't moved. He thought about what he knew about Vivian Sterling's reputation, the specific quality of her calls, the companies she'd backed, and what had happened to them, the ones she'd passed on, and why. I need to ask you something, Carter said. Go ahead. You've been watching this company for 4 months before the article. How? Vivian didn't hesitate. Paula Hendricks mentioned you in a conversation I have with her quarterly about the agricultural supply market. I looked into it. I liked what I found, so I kept looking. She met his eyes. I like companies that are solving real problems for people who aren't glamorous. Farmers aren't glamorous. Agricultural components aren't glamorous. But they're essential, and the people who solve essential problems well build things that last. Carter sat with that for a moment. The advisory relationship, he said. 2 days a month. What does that actually look like? It looks like whatever you need it to look like, she said. I've built 4 companies before this fund. I've advised 12 more. I'm not going to come in and tell you how to run your production floor. But when you're making the next level decisions, market expansion, product line strategy, the next capital event, I've navigated those before and I can be useful. And if I disagree with your advice, she looked at him steadily. Then you tell me why and we talk about it. And at the end of it, you make the call. It's your company. Carter looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the production floor through the glass partition, at the machines, at the team. at the notebooks on the shelf, at all the accumulated weight of what 2 years of stubborn, imperfect, costly forward motion looked like when it had solidified into something real. "I'm going to need to look at the term sheet with my attorney," he said. "Of course," Vivian said, "and I want Priya in the room for any technical discussions going forward," he said. "She understands the design pipeline better than anyone now." "That's a good instinct," Vivian said, with something that was definitely not a smile, but was adjacent to one. Carter nodded. He looked at his hands on the table, the hands that had been flat on cold concrete, that had held a socket wrench at age 7, that had made a drive shaft fitting 3 times until it was right, that had built this thing out of the materials that were left after everything else was gone. "I'll call you after I've read the term sheet," he said. Vivian stood, extended her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm, unself-conscious. "One more thing," she said. "Yeah?" She nodded at the shelf of notebooks. "Don't let Priya's documentation system replace those entirely." Carter looked at the notebooks, at the oil stains and the grease thumbprints and the snail sketch in the margin of the first one. "I wasn't going to," he said. She left with her associate, and Carter stood in the doorway watching the car go, the way he'd stood watching Paula Hendricks's car go, and the way he'd stood watching his wife's car leave a driveway in the rain 2 years ago. Though this was nothing like that. This was the opposite of that in every way that mattered. Bobby appeared at his shoulder. "Well," Bobby said. Carter thought about where to start. "She's not what I expected," he said. "Good or bad?" "Neither." He considered it. "More serious than I expected, and less interested in what I expected her to be interested in." Bobby was quiet. Then, "Are you going to do the deal?" Carter looked at the production floor, at the life inside it, at what it had cost to build, and what it was still in the process of becoming. "I think so," he said, "but I'm reading every line of the term sheet first." "Obviously," Bobby said. "And Rita's reading it after me." "Obviously," Bobby said again, and went back to work. Carter stood there a moment longer. The facility sound settled around him, the machines, the voices, the particular living hum of a place where people were doing real work. He'd spent so long in the silence of the garage, in the middle of the night quiet of a man building something alone, that the sound of this still sometimes struck him as remarkable, the sound of a thing that had grown large enough to make noise. He went back to his desk. The term sheet would arrive by end of week. He had a production review with May at 3 o'clock. Jesse had flagged a potential improvement on the batch process he wanted to walk through. And Rosie had a school thing on Friday, a presentation on what she wanted to be when she grew up, for which she had, after careful deliberation, chosen an inventor, which she'd told Carter with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who had made a reasonable and informed decision. He'd told her that was a good choice. She'd said she knew. He opened the 4th notebook to the page he'd been working on, the new coupling redesign, the one he'd been thinking about for 3 months, the one Priya had reviewed and said had real merit, and also 3 questions she'd written in the margin that he needed to answer before the spec could move forward. He picked up his pen. He answered the first question, then the second. The third was harder. He sat with it for a while, the way you sit with the problems that don't have easy answers, the ones that need time and pressure, and the particular quality of attention that you only have when you're fully in the work and not watching yourself be in it. The production floor moved around him, steady and real. He sat there until the answer came. Rita Espinoza read the Sterling Meridian term sheet in 45 minutes and called Carter while he was eating lunch at his desk, which was a sandwich he'd made that morning and forgotten about until noon. "It's clean," Rita said. "Cleaner than the mass capital agreement, actually. The minority position is genuine. There's no ratchet clause, no conversion mechanism that gives them control under performance triggers. What she told you in the room is what the paper says." "The advisory terms," Carter said, 2 days a month specified in the agreement as strategic advisory with no operational authority. She can't direct your team, she can't override your decisions. If the relationship breaks down, either party can terminate the advisory with 60 days' notice without affecting the equity position. Carter set down the sandwich. "That's unusual." It's very unusual, Rita said. It means she's serious about what she told you. She separated the money from the influence deliberately. A pause. Carter, I've reviewed a lot of investment agreements. People who put this kind of language in a term sheet are either very confident in the founder or very confident in their own read of the situation. Sometimes both. Or it's a trap I'm not seeing, Carter said. I spent 45 minutes looking for the trap, Rita said. I didn't find one. That's not a guarantee, but it's something. He signed the Sterling Meridian Agreement on a Friday in March in Rita's office, with Priya present because he'd meant what he said about having her in the room for anything touching the design pipeline. Rita witnessed. Priya read the technical licensing language with the focused attention of an engineer encountering legal text. She asked two clarifying questions that were, Carter thought, better questions than most lawyers would have asked. When it was done, Carter drove home with the windows down despite the cold, which was the thing he did when something shifted and he needed air. He picked up Rosie from school. She got into the truck and looked at him with those eyes that read him like a document. Something happened, she said. Good something, he said. How good? Pretty good. She considered this. Ice cream good or pizza good? Carter looked at his daughter, 7 years old now, first grade, inventor in training, the person who had been asleep upstairs on the worst afternoon of his life and had not known it, and whose presence had been the only argument he needed to get off the floor. Both, he said. Rosie's expression suggested this was a satisfactory outcome. They got pizza first and ice cream after, which Rosie maintained was the correct order because you couldn't have dessert without dinner, a principle she'd apparently absorbed from somewhere and applied with legislative seriousness. They sat in the pizza place on Route 9 that had checkered tablecloths and a television in the corner that nobody watched, and Carter watched his daughter eat pizza with the total commitment she brought to food she liked, and thought about how many of the most important moments of the last 2 years had been in ordinary places, diners, trucks, kitchen tables, a cold concrete floor, and how the ordinariness of them was not incidental, but essential, because that was where actual life happened. In the plain places without ceremony. Daddy, Rosie said, with pizza still in her mouth, which Carter normally corrected. Finish chewing, he said. She finished chewing. Is the company going to be okay? He looked at her. She asked direct questions, always had, and she'd been listening to things. Not eavesdropping, just the natural absorption of a child who lived inside her father's life and paid attention to it. She knew the word company now. She knew Bobby's name and May's name and Priya's. She sometimes asked about the notebooks with the proprietary interest of someone who felt she had a stake in them, which she did, in ways she didn't yet fully understand. Yeah, Carter said. It's going to be okay. You're sure? He was quiet for a moment because she was 7 and she deserved a real answer, not a reassuring one. I'm sure that the work is good. I'm sure about the people. The rest has a lot of variables. Rosie thought about this. But you're not scared? I'm always a little scared, Carter said. That doesn't change. You just learn to work while you're scared. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely classify, part assessment, part something older than 7. The look of a child who has watched an adult navigate difficulty and has been quietly building a model of how that works. Okay, she said, and went back to her pizza. That was all she needed, apparently. The honest answer was enough. Carter filed that away beside all the other things his daughter had taught him, without knowing she was teaching him anything. The next 18 months were not the triumphant linear ascent that company success stories tend to become when they're told backward from the destination. They were a series of problems at increasing scale, which is what growth actually is. Not the absence of trouble, but trouble that gets more complicated and more expensive and occasionally more interesting as the business gets larger and the stakes get higher. The Hendricks relationship expanded as Paula had indicated it would, and with that expansion came volume that required Hayes Industrial to operate with a production discipline that was different in kind from the garage days. Consistency at scale is harder than quality in small batches. Carter knew this from his Dunmore years and had thought he'd prepared for it, and had prepared for it less completely than he'd thought. There was a production run in April that came in with a defect rate 4 times the acceptable threshold, which Jesse caught during quality inspection, which meant the units never reached Hendricks, which was the only thing that made it manageable rather than catastrophic. But it cost them 3 weeks of rework time, one very direct conversation with Paula that Carter handled by calling her himself rather than waiting for her to call him. We had a quality failure on the April run. I'm telling you before it affects your schedule. Here's what happened, and here's what we're fixing. And a root cause analysis that Priya led with the thoroughness of an engineer who understood that solving the symptom without finding the cause just delayed the next version of the same problem. The cause was a materials batch that had come in with inconsistent hardness from a supplier who had changed their sourcing without notification. Carter called the supplier, had a conversation that was not pleasant but was clear, and changed suppliers within the month. He also built a materials incoming inspection protocol that May documented and that Jesse became the point person for because Jesse had caught the production failure and that catch deserved to become a responsibility. Vivian Sterling came for her first advisory day in April, 2 weeks after the production failure, which was not great timing from a surface optics standpoint and which Carter decided to treat as an opportunity rather than a liability. He showed her the root cause analysis. He showed her the new incoming inspection protocol. He showed her the supplier change and the reasoning behind it. She read through the documentation and said, "You're showing me the failure." "It happened," Carter said. "You're going to hear about it one way or another." Most founders would have timed the first advisory session for a better moment. "Most founders are managing what I look like," Carter said. "I'm managing the company." Vivian looked at the root cause document for a moment longer. "This analysis is good," she said. "Priya?" "Priya and Jesse," Carter said. Jesse caught the failure. He should get credit for how it was handled. Vivian made a note. Then she looked at him. "What do you actually need from me today?" The question was practical and direct, and Carter appreciated it because he'd thought about it. "We have a decision coming up about the next product line. I want to go into the industrial pump sector. I think there's a design gap in their secondary sealing components that looks like the same kind of problem we solved in agricultural, the existing manufacturers optimizing for production cost and ignoring service life. But it's a new market for us. I want your read on the entry strategy." Vivian leaned back. "How long have you been thinking about pumps?" "Notebook 4, Carter said. "About 20 months. She almost smiled at that. "Walk me through what you've got." They spent 3 hours on the pump question, Carter and Vivian and Priya, at the work table with the notebooks and Priya's documentation and a whiteboard that Priya had written on so thoroughly by the end that it looked like a crime scene. Vivian's contribution was specific and useful, not the answers, but the right pressure applied to the right questions, the kind of thinking that comes from having navigated market entry decisions enough times to know where the hidden costs live. She left at 4 o'clock, and Carter walked her to the car. "The pump sector," Vivian said at the car door. "Your read on the gap is right, but entry timing matters more than you think in that market. Call Hendricks and ask Paula who her top 3 pump equipment customers are. That's your test market before you commit to full product development." Carter nodded. "I would have gotten there," he said. "It would have taken me another month." "That's what advisory is for," she said. "A month is expensive at your stage." She drove away. Carter stood in the parking lot for a moment in the late afternoon light, thinking about the month that had just been saved and the 20 months of notebook thinking that had made the conversation possible in the first place. He called Paula Hendricks from the parking lot. She named 3 pump equipment customers without hesitation, gave him 2 of their phone numbers directly, and said, "I was wondering when you were going to move in that direction," which made Carter feel simultaneously validated and slightly irked, because it meant he'd been slower than the obvious. The test market conversations happened over 6 weeks. Carter did 4 of them himself and sent Priya to 2, because Priya had the technical language and the engineering credibility that opened doors Carter's mechanic and machinist background occasionally didn't. What they found confirmed the design gap, which confirmed the notebook, which confirmed that the instinct that had been accumulating since Carter first started writing things down in a leaking garage was still running true. The pump sealing component went into development in June, Priya leading the design formalization and Carter staying close but not directing. The hardest discipline he'd developed, the capacity to supervise without controlling, to hold the standard without holding the pen. He got it wrong sometimes. He stepped in too early on 2 design decisions and had to acknowledge that to Priya directly, which she accepted without drama and with the specific grace of someone who'd been waiting for it to happen and wasn't surprised. "I know what I'm doing," Priya said, not angrily, just clearly. "I know you do," Carter said. "I'm working on trusting that better." "Work faster," she said, which was not unkind. He laughed, which surprised both of them slightly. "Fair," he said. By the end of that second year of formal operation, by the time Hayes Industrial Technologies had 22 employees and 5 active product lines and relationships with 2 distributors and 1 direct industrial customer, Carter had learned something about himself that he wasn't sure he would have learned any other way. He was not a natural manager of people. He was a natural builder of things, which was related but not the same, and the gap between those 2 abilities had cost him something at various points along the way. He'd been too slow to delegate twice, too fast to delegate once, too absorbed in the design work when the operations needed him, and too absorbed in the operations when the design work needed him. He'd been right about the important things, and wrong about a handful of smaller things that weren't actually smaller once they'd compounded into problems. He'd been harder on people than he needed to be when he was stressed twice, and had acknowledged it both times in the specific way he'd had to learn, directly, without excessive self-punishment, without the performance of contrition that is really just another form of self-focus. "I was short with you on Tuesday. That was about my pressure, not your work. I'll do better." Bobby had looked at him the first time he'd done this and said nothing, which in Bobby's register meant something. The second Carter household had order and rhythm in it now. Rosie was 7 going on 40, reading chapter books, doing second-grade math with a seriousness that her teacher described in parent conferences as enthusiastic, and had developed a friendship with a girl named Juniper from school that involved elaborate games whose rules changed daily and whose logic was internal and completely consistent to both of them. She talked about her father's company with the casual ownership of a child who has absorbed something as simply a fact of life, and she sometimes drew pictures of machines in her sketchbook, which bore no relation to actual machines but had a design confidence that Carter looked at and felt something he didn't have a word for. Lisa called periodically. The calls were what they were: careful, cordial, the conversations of people who had been through something together that could not be undone, and had decided, separately and then collectively, to handle the aftermath with a minimum of additional damage. She'd come for Rosie's birthday in December. It had been uncomfortable, and then less uncomfortable, and then almost ordinary, which was the best it was going to be and was enough. Rosie had a mother who showed up when she said she would, which was not everything but was not nothing, and Carter had learned to hold that accounting without running it further in either direction. Gerald Pitts still came on Tuesday mornings, now to the Dunmore facility rather than the garage, bringing his own mug and sitting on the stool by the production floor window with the proprietary air of a man who considers himself a founding advisor. Carter let him because Gerald was one of the first people who had looked at what Carter was trying to build and said, "Not bad. And some debts are not monetary." "You've done all right," Gerald said one Tuesday, looking at the floor. "Working on it," Carter said. Gerald looked at him. "You should be able to say you've done all right by now." Carter thought about it. "Saying it out loud makes me nervous." "Why?" "Because the second you say it, the thing that undoes it is somewhere around the corner." Gerald picked up his coffee mug. "The thing that undoes it is always somewhere around the corner," he said. "That doesn't mean you don't get to say it." He looked at the floor again. "Your father would have said you've done all right." Carter was quiet for a moment. Earl Hayes had been gone for 6 years now, and the specific weight of that absence had changed shape over time. Not lighter exactly, but different, less raw, more architectural. He still heard his father's voice sometimes in the garage, in the particular transmission of a person you learned from before you knew you were learning. You don't need to buy what you can build. You don't need to beg for what you can fix. "Yeah," Carter said. "He would have." Gerald nodded. He drank his coffee. Outside the window, the production floor ran its Tuesday rhythm, and neither of them said anything for a while, which was the kind of silence that old acquaintances can sit inside without it meaning anything more than that they're both present and it's enough. It was Vivian's 4th advisory session, on a Wednesday in August, when something shifted between them that Carter hadn't anticipated and afterward wasn't sure he should have been surprised by. They'd finished the actual work, a 3-hour session on the pump component market entry, which had progressed to a point where the question was no longer whether to enter, but how fast and through which channel. And Priya had left, and May had stopped by to confirm a scheduling question, and the facility was winding into its end-of-day mode. Carter was walking Vivian to the parking lot, which he did because it was basic courtesy, not because there was anything to extend. She stopped at the parking lot edge and turned back to look at the building. Carter looked too. The Dunmore facility was not beautiful. It was a concrete industrial unit with a loading dock and a sign Carter had ordered 6 months ago that said, Hayes Industrial Technologies in clean letters on a white background. It was functional. It had, if you looked closely, the unmistakable quality of a place that was growing faster than its architecture. Small improvisations everywhere, the marks of decisions made at speed and under pressure. That building behind your house, Vivian said. You mentioned it when we first talked about the early days. The garage, Carter said. You still have it? Still have it. She turned to look at him. Why? Carter had answered this question before. To visitors, to the occasional journalist who'd made it this far, to Bobby once, to Rosie, who was too young for the real answer. He had a version he gave, which was true as far as it went, but standing in a parking lot with the day settling around them and nothing left to transact, he found himself giving the other version. Because I'm not sure I trust myself to forget what it was like, he said. When you've been in a place where there was nothing, when you've sat on the floor of that garage with the rain coming through and $400 in your account and a 5-year-old asleep upstairs and known that you had no safety net and no backup plan, you don't want to lose access to that, not because it felt good. It didn't feel good, but it was real in a way that's harder to find the further you get from it. Vivian was quiet, looking at him. And because Rosie deserves to know where things started, he said. Someday, when she's old enough to understand that the starting point matters as much as where you end up. Vivian looked at him for a moment longer than was entirely businesslike. You should show her now, she said. Kids understand more than adults think. Carter thought about Rosie's homework on seeds, about the most important thing a plant needs, about his daughter at the pizza table asking, Are you scared, and accepting yes, a little, as a satisfactory answer. Maybe you're right, he said. They stood in the parking lot in the late summer evening, and it was just a parking lot, just an ordinary place, no different from the gas station parking lots and diner parking lots and school pickup lines where Carter had been having important moments for 2 years. Vivian Sterling was not a romantic figure to him. Not then, not yet. She was the most intellectually serious person he'd encountered in the building of this company, and she was someone he had come to trust in a specific and earned way that was different from how he trusted Bobby or May or Rita, more personal than those, less defined than anything else. Carter, she said. Yeah. The pump component spec. Priya's going to want to push the timeline, push it to 30 weeks, not 24. She's right about the timeline. She's just being polite about it. Carter looked at her. We're done working for the day. I know, she said. I thought of it now. He almost laughed. All right, I'll tell her 30 weeks. Vivian nodded. She opened her car door. Same time next month? She said. Same time, Carter said. She left. Carter stood there as the taillights turned out of the parking lot, and he thought, briefly, honestly, then filed it away because there was too much else to manage, that the most unexpected things about the last 2 years were not the things he'd been afraid of or the things he'd planned for, but the things that arrived quietly and without announcement, the way some problems do and the way some people do. 3 years after the rainy afternoon when the divorce papers lay on the kitchen table, Carter Hayes drove back to the house on a Saturday morning in October, loaded Rosie into the truck, and drove her to the property that still held both things, the house where they lived and the garage behind it, unchanged from the outside, the patched roof still visible in its imperfect repair, the door with its old latch that still required the specific two-handed maneuver Carter had never gotten around to fixing. Rosie was 7 and 3 months and was currently reading a book about the history of engines, which she'd selected herself from the library and which was aggressively above her reading level and which she was working through with dictatorial patience, looking up words she didn't know and writing them in a little notebook that Carter had given her 6 months ago, without ceremony. as if it were a practical object and not the thing it obviously also was. He opened the garage door. The smell was still there, oil and metal and cold concrete. The workbench was the same, with its burn marks and its history. The failed auger fitting, the first one, the wrong one, the one he'd kept without a plan to keep it, was still on the corner of the workbench where it had sat for 3 years. The notebooks, the first 2 of them, were still on the shelf because Carter hadn't moved them. The drill press that had been his father's was still in the corner, unplugged, too old for the Dunmore facility's production needs, too important to sell. Rosie stood in the doorway and looked around. She'd been in the garage before. She'd grown up aware of it the way children grow up aware of all the spaces around them. But she'd never had it explained to her the way Carter was going to explain it now, which was as a choice, a decision he was making about what she should know and when. "This is where it started," Carter said. Rosie walked in slowly, looking at everything. She walked to the workbench and looked at the tools. She looked at the notebooks on the shelf. She picked up the failed auger fitting and turned it in her hands. "What is this?" she said. "First part I made when I was trying to save a farmer's combine," Carter said. "It didn't work. That's why I kept it." Rosie turned it over. She ran her thumb along the machined face. "Because it was wrong?" "Because it was the first attempt," Carter said. "And the first attempt is how you find out what the right one needs to be." She set it back on the bench. She looked at the notebooks. "Can I look?" "Yeah." She opened the first one carefully. The way she handled things she understood were important. She went through it slowly, the way Gerald had, the way Vivian had. She stopped at the sketch Rosie herself had once called a snail, the early auger-fitting design, crude and annotated, with looks like a snail written in the margin in her father's handwriting, and beneath it in smaller letters, kind of does. She looked up at him. "You wrote what I said." "Yeah," Carter said. She looked back at the notebook. Something in her face changed, settled. The expression of a child understanding that they were part of something, that their small moments had been recorded and kept and mattered. Carter watched his daughter's face and felt the specific weight of that, and let it sit without trying to turn it into a lesson, because it was already its own lesson, and she was already getting it. "You built the company from here," she said. "Started it here," he said. "Built it somewhere else, but yeah." She stood in the middle of the garage for a moment, looking around at the whole of it, the imperfect patched roof, the workbench with its 3 years of accumulated marks, the drill press in the corner, the notebooks on the shelf, the concrete floor with its oil stains that would never come out now. "Why didn't you tear it down," she said, "when you moved to the big place?" Carter had been asked this. He had the answer he gave, which was true. He gave it to his daughter now in the simplest form it had, stripped of the layers he'd built around it for other audiences. "Because I need to remember that the hard part was also the real part," he said. "And I need you to know that you can start with nothing and build something, not because it's easy. It isn't easy, but because when you have nothing left, you find out what you're actually made of, and sometimes what you find is enough." Rosie looked at him with those wide, dark eyes that had been watching him navigate this for 3 years, absorbing it all, building her own model of how difficulty works and what you do with it. "What did you find?" she said. Carter thought about the question honestly. Not the version of the answer that made a good story, but the actual thing, the real inventory of what he'd discovered about himself in the garage in the rain, with no money and no plan, and one reason to keep going. "That I could do more than I thought if I stopped waiting for conditions to be right," he said. "That asking for help isn't the same as giving up. That the first attempt is always wrong, and that's not a reason not to make it." He paused. "And that you were worth doing all of it for." Rosie looked at him for a long moment. Then she did the thing she'd done since she was small. She just nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to looking at the notebook. They stayed in the garage for almost an hour. Rosie asked questions about the sketches, about the tools, about the drill press in the corner. Carter answered all of them. She asked if she could have the notebook, the first one, and Carter said no. It stayed in the garage, but she could have her own, which she already did. "Mine's different," she said. Mine has words in it." "So does mine," Carter said, pointing to the annotations. "A design notebook should have words. That's how you explain the thinking. She looked at the notebook with fresh consideration. Okay, she said, then mine is right. On the way out, she stopped at the door and looked back at the garage one more time. Daddy, she said. Yeah? We should come back here sometimes, so you don't forget. Carter looked at his daughter standing in the doorway of the garage where everything had started. 7 years old with a notebook in her hand and her mother's eyes and her grandfather's jaw and something entirely her own in the way she looked at the world. Yeah, he said, we will. He pulled the door shut behind them. The latch clicked, the way it always had. 4 years after the afternoon of the rain, Hayes Industrial Technologies had 31 employees, 7 product lines, agreements with 3 distributors, and a reputation in the agricultural and light industrial supply markets that had taken root in the specific way that real things take root. Not through marketing, not through the management of perception, but through products that worked better than the ones they replaced, and a team of people who understood why that mattered. Vivian Sterling's advisory relationship had evolved in the way that honest working relationships between serious people sometimes do. Not dramatically, not with announcement, but through the accumulation of time spent on real problems, through the specific intimacy of watching someone think, through the moment 8 months in when Carter had called her at 9 o'clock on a Thursday evening about a distribution decision that needed to move the next morning, and she'd answered and talked it through for 40 minutes without once making him feel that the call was an imposition. He'd noticed. She'd noticed that he'd noticed. They'd both filed it, and neither of them had said anything about it directly for another 3 months, because they were both people who did things by thinking them through first. When they eventually said it, they said it the way they did most things, directly, without particular ceremony, in a conversation that was the outgrowth of a longer conversation about something else entirely, which was the honest shape of how important things get said between people who have been paying attention to each other. I think this has been moving in a direction, Carter said. I know it has, Vivian said. I'm not sure how to do this right, he said, given the professional situation. Neither am I, she said. I've never been in this specific situation. What do you want to do about it? She looked at him with the direct attention he'd come to know as simply the way she inhabited a conversation. I want to figure it out honestly, she said. I'm not interested in pretending it isn't happening. Neither am I, he said. It was not simple. The professional relationship had to be restructured. Rita was involved, new terms around the advisory arrangement, a clear accounting of the Sterling Meridian equity position as an investment held at arm's length from anything personal, documents that Carter read entirely, and Vivian insisted on because she said, with characteristic directness, I'm not going to have this look like something it isn't. It took 2 months and 3 conversations and one genuinely difficult evening where they both said things that needed to be said about what they each needed and what they were afraid of and what they were not willing to compromise on. It was also not uncomplicated in the way that single parents entering new relationships are not uncomplicated, because Rosie was not an abstraction and her life was not a variable that Carter was willing to manage around his own preferences. He talked to Rosie before anything else, in the plain way he'd learned to talk to her, honestly, without overselling, giving her room to have whatever reaction she was going to have. There's someone I've been spending time with, he said. She's been helping with the company. I like her. Rosie looked at him from across the kitchen table, 8 years old now, measured and particular. Is she nice? Yes, Carter said. She's direct. She says what she thinks. Rosie considered this. Do you say what you think? I try to. Then that's probably good, Rosie said, with the pragmatic wisdom of a child who has been watching her father navigate difficulty for 3 years and has formed some views about what works. Vivian met Rosie on a Saturday morning at the house, unannounced to Rosie in the sense that Carter hadn't made it an occasion, hadn't framed it, had just said someone's coming by and let it be what it was. Vivian arrived with her characteristic punctuality and no particular strategy, which Carter had privately decided was the right approach because children see through strategy immediately, and what they need to see is just the person. Rosie looked at Vivian for a long moment when she arrived. Vivian looked back without performing anything. You're the investor, Rosie said. I was, Vivian said. It's a bit different now. Rosie thought about this. How? That's a good question, Vivian said. I'm still figuring it out, honestly. Rosie appeared to find this an acceptable answer. Do you want to see my engine book? She said. Yes, Vivian said, without hesitation and without condescension, with what appeared to be actual interest, which it was. They sat at the kitchen table for 40 minutes, and Rosie walked Vivian through the history of the internal combustion engine with the focused authority of someone who has read a thing thoroughly and would like you to understand it. Vivian asked 3 questions that were genuinely good questions, which Rosie answered with visible satisfaction. Carter made coffee and watched from the kitchen and felt something settle in him that he recognized as relief. The specific kind that comes when something you were afraid might be complicated turns out to be, in this particular way on this particular morning, not complicated at all. It would be complicated in other ways, at other times. That was simply what it was. Nothing real is without its difficult edges. But the Saturday morning was what it was, and Carter Hayes stood in his kitchen drinking coffee and let it be good. The garage behind the house had a visitor one afternoon in November, a young man of about 23 named Marcus, who'd grown up 3 streets over, whose bicycle Carter had fixed in the very early months of the garage operation, and who had graduated the previous spring with a degree in mechanical engineering and come home to a county where the job market for engineers was not what the brochures had suggested. Carter had heard about this through the neighborhood telegraph and had told Marcus, when Marcus came by the Dunmore facility to ask if there was work, that there wasn't exactly. They were fully staffed on production, and the design team was where it needed to be. But that if Marcus had ideas, Carter would look at them. Marcus had brought 3. They were rough, genuinely rough, the way first ideas are when the thinker has more instinct than experience. But underneath the roughness was something that Carter recognized because he'd seen it before, in his own notebooks from the early days. The middle one, Carter said, the seal design. Walk me through your thinking. Marcus walked him through it. He made a mistake in the middle that Carter caught and corrected, and the way Marcus received the correction, not defensively, not with the armor of someone whose ego is in the idea, but with the focused attention of someone who actually wants to understand, told Carter most of what he needed to know. Come back next week, Carter said. I want you to talk to Priya. Marcus came back. He and Priya spent 3 hours together, which resulted in a report from Priya that said, with characteristic economy, rough but real, worth developing. He needs structure, not correction, which was a distinction Carter understood because it was a distinction someone had once made about him implicitly through the way they chose to engage. He offered Marcus a junior design role. The salary was modest, and Carter said so directly. It'll move if you earn it, Carter said. I know, Marcus said. You're known for that. Carter looked at him. What am I known for? Marcus thought about it. Paying what you say you'll pay, he said. Being straight with people. Not pretending things are better than they are. Carter sat with that for a moment. Not genius inventor or brilliant businessman or any of the language that got used in the occasional profile. Being straight with people. Not pretending. Okay, he said. Monday. The year turned, and the work continued, as work does when it is built on something real. Bobby ran the production floor with the authority of a man who had grown into a title without ever having required the title. May's organizational systems had become the skeleton of the company's operations, the invisible structure that made everything else possible. Priya had 3 engineers in her design team now, and was herself becoming the kind of engineer who makes other engineers better, which is a specific and rare quality. Jesse had become the quality lead, a role he'd grown into without entirely noticing he was growing, which was the best kind of growth. Carter still kept the ledger. Not because the accounting system required it. May's systems were comprehensive, and Carter understood the financials through those. He kept it because it was the practice of paying attention, of knowing exactly where things were every morning, without depending on a report to tell him. Some people thought this was inefficiency. Carter thought it was discipline, which is different, and which is one of the things he'd decided about himself during those first 8 months that had turned out to be true in ways that mattered. On the last day of that 4th year, Carter sat in his office in the Dunmore facility after everyone had gone home, with the 5th notebook open in front of him and the production floor quiet beyond the glass. 23 months into the pump component market, which had gone well, not easily, but well. 2 new product lines in development, a conversation with Paula Hendricks about a distribution partnership in a new region that would require, again, more capacity than they currently had, which was the specific pleasurable problem of a company that was in the right direction. He picked up his pen. He wrote, at the top of a new page, a question about the sealing problem Marcus had been working on, because Marcus's seal design had a flaw that Carter had been thinking about for 3 days, and the thinking had finally resolved into something. He worked for 40 minutes. The building settled around him. The notebook filled by another page. At 8 o'clock, he put the pen down, closed the notebook, and drove home. Rosie was at the kitchen table with her own notebook, drawing something complicated with total concentration. Vivian was on the couch reading, glasses on, the specific domestic image of a person who has learned where things go in a house and has made themselves at home in it. He stood in the doorway for a moment without saying anything, just looking at the kitchen and the couch and the 2 people in them and the way the light fell across everything. Hard day? Vivian said, without looking up. Good day, Carter said. How good? He thought about the notebook, the new question at the top of the page, the 31 people who came to work every morning on something that had started in a garage with a patched roof and his father's drill press and one reason to keep going. Pretty good, he said. Rosie looked up from her notebook. She looked at her father in the doorway the way she'd been looking at him for 4 years, with that clear, steady attention that saw more than it said, that had been watching him figure it out and had formed its own conclusions about what that looked like. Come see what I drew, she said. He crossed the room and sat beside his daughter and looked at the notebook. She'd been drawing a machine. Not a real machine, not any design he recognized, but something with her own internal logic, with components that suggested she'd been thinking about how parts connect and what they're for. What is it? He said. I don't know yet, she said. I'm still figuring it out. Carter looked at the drawing, at the idea in its earliest form, rough and uncertain and alive with the particular energy of things that don't know yet what they're going to be. That's all right, he said. That's exactly where you start. He put his arm around his daughter's shoulders. She leaned into him slightly, the way she'd started to do, the weight of a person who knows where they belong. Outside, the October night had gone cold and clear, and somewhere behind the house, past the yard and the broken fence that still hadn't been fixed, the garage sat quiet in the dark, with its patched roof and its unlocked door, and everything that had happened inside it. Every first attempt, every failed fitting, every midnight calculation, every page of every notebook that had been filled before anyone knew there was anything worth filling, all of it still there, undisturbed, the way the beginning of things stays with you when you've had the sense to keep it.